You begin, as Agrippina began, in a city that seemed permanent. Rome in the early 1st century was a place of stone streets and slow routines. The empire stretched from the misted edges of Britain to the sands of Syria, but the center of it all smelled of damp marble and olive smoke. Public fountains trickled day and night. Laundry women beat cloth against wooden boards. Scribes carried wax tablets across the forum, while mule carts rattled past temples whose columns were already centuries old. To live here was to live with noise, but also with a kind of steady sameness. The world changed by decree, not by rush. Into the city, on a November morning in the year 15 CE, came Julia Agrippina, later called the Younger. She was the first child of Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, a couple whose names already carried the heavy weight of dynasty. Her father was the popular general adopted into the family of Emperor Tiberius. Her mother descended from Augustus himself. From birth, Agrippina's life was marked by the simple fact that the empire considered her important. But importance in Rome was rarely comfortable. Imagine the house in which she opened her eyes. Not a palace of endless marble, but a patrician domus near the Palatine Hill. Walls painted in faded reds and deep greens. Floors of black and white mosaic that felt cool under bare feet. Servants moved with quiet efficiency, bringing warm water, keeping the lamps trimmed, recording the date of birth in careful script. A Roman infant was swaddled tightly, not for beauty but because tradition said a straight body made a straight life. Her earliest sensations would have been of cloth, of voices speaking low Latin, of the rhythmic clatter from the street beyond the door. Daily life for an elite Roman girl followed a measured pattern. At dawn, the household stirred as slaves opened shutters to let in the mild autumn light. A nurse checked the baby's breathing, while another servant carried a tray of bread and honey to Agrippina's mother. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from kitchen fires. Breakfast was modest. Watered wine for adults, porridge for children, fruit if the season allowed. These details, the quiet chores of countless mornings, shaped her world more than any future throne. Outside, the city functioned on schedules set generations before. The forum opened early. Markets bustled until noon. Magistrates heard petitions in the shade of basilicas. Germanicus, her father, followed a routine of paperwork, audience, and military dispatch. When he left the house, lictors cleared a path through the crowd, their rods and axes symbols of office rather than weapons. For young Agrippina, the sight of her father's retinue must have been ordinary, no more startling than the sound of street musicians or the cries of vendors selling figs. Yet beneath the surface calm lay tension. The Julio-Claudian family had already known exile, poison, and sudden death. Emperor Tiberius ruled from a distance on the island of Capri, suspicious of rivals. Germanicus was beloved by the people, a fact that made him dangerous. Agrippina the Elder, proud and outspoken, kept a mental list of friends and enemies. Even as a child, the younger Agrippina would hear names spoken in whispers: Sejanus, Piso, Livilla, each carrying rumors of betrayal. It was a household where lessons in reading and arithmetic came alongside lessons in caution. Her education began almost as soon as she could speak. A Greek tutor recited Homer in a measured voice, expecting the little girl to follow the rhythm. Another instructor taught her the steady shapes of Latin letters on wax tablets. Needlework occupied the afternoons. The goal was not only refinement but survival. A well-educated daughter could manage estates, read contracts, and recognize when a legal phrase concealed a threat. These were the quiet tools of power in an empire that rarely allowed women to hold office but often relied on their subtle influence. Food, too, told the story of rank and routine. Lunch might include olives, cheese, and a simple bread called panis. Dinner, taken in the cool of evening, offered stewed lentils, fish from the Tiber, and sometimes the luxury of imported dates. Slaves brought each dish to low tables while family members reclined on couches. Conversation mattered more than speed. Children listened as elders discussed Senate decrees, distant campaigns, and the small frictions of city politics. Agrippina's earliest memories would have been filled with these measured voices, the slow turning of public life into private talk. When she was still a small child, her father's duties carried the family far from Rome. Germanicus was appointed to command legions along the Rhine, and later to govern the eastern provinces. Travel for a Roman elite was not a sudden adventure but a long process of preparation. Household goods were inventoried, staff assignments made, letters of introduction sealed with wax. Caravans moved at the pace of oxen and weather. For Agrippina, the journey meant days of creaking wagons, the smell of leather harness, and the endless sound of iron-shod wheels on stone. These travels exposed her to a wider world but also to its dangers. The northern frontier smelled of pine and damp earth. Soldiers drilled in icy fog. Local tribes traded furs and honey, their languages unfamiliar. Each stop required new accommodations: a governor's villa, a temporary camp, or a converted warehouse near a river port. Life became a sequence of repeated tasks: setting up beds, boiling water, securing food, small acts of persistence that etched themselves into a child's memory more deeply than any grand ceremony. It was during these years that Agrippina's younger brothers were born, including Gaius, later known as Caligula. The family grew, but so did the shadow of politics. Germanicus' popularity with the legions worried Tiberius. Reports of unrest traveled slowly back to Rome but weighed heavily. At evening meals, when soldiers brought news from distant outposts, her parents spoke in careful tones. Agrippina listened. She learned that words could be both shields and weapons. When she was about 4, the family moved east to Antioch. The city smelled of spice markets and sea wind. Here, too, daily life settled into pattern. Mornings of instruction, afternoons of measured play, evenings of formal dinners with provincial elites. Yet rumors of intrigue followed them. In the year 19, Germanicus fell ill under circumstances many found suspicious. Medical treatment in the Roman world was slow and ritualized. Poultices of herbs, prayers to Asclepius, long watches through the night. Despite every effort, he died. The death of a father under possible poison would shape any childhood. For Agrippina, it was an early lesson that affection and danger could share a single household. Her mother gathered the children and began the long return to Rome. That journey was marked not by swift imperial escort but by deliberate ceremony. At each city, ashes of the general were displayed for public mourning. Crowds lined the roads in silence. A young girl watched adults weep and understood, perhaps dimly, that her life was now threaded to the slow machinery of imperial politics. Back in Rome, the family occupied a different position. Honored in public, watched in private. Agrippina resumed her lessons, grammar, music, the careful reading of legal texts. Her mother became a figure of quiet opposition to Tiberius, and the household learned to measure every word. Festivals continued as they always had. Saturnalia with its brief license, the Lupercalia with its runners through the streets, the endless birthdays of imperial relatives. But beneath the bright banners lay an unchanging truth. The Julio-Claudian clan devoured its own. You can picture Agrippina at 10 or 11, standing at the edge of the forum during a public ceremony. The marble glints in late afternoon sun. The crowd murmurs as officials read decrees in a flat, deliberate voice. She is a child surrounded by history that moves no faster than the turning of the Tiber. Already she has learned to stand still, to watch, to remember. Her adolescence approached with the same careful rhythm. Household slaves marked the calendar of religious observances. Her tutors pressed her to memorize passages from Virgil and to debate points of Stoic philosophy. Marriage negotiations, though not yet serious, were whispered among relatives. To grow up as a Roman noblewoman was to feel the slow tightening of duty long before adulthood arrived. By the time Agrippina reached her mid-teens, The patterns of her life, ritual, caution, endurance, were firmly set. She had witnessed travel across provinces, the sudden death of a father, the silent rivalries of an imperial court. Each day's small tasks, writing letters, overseeing servants, reciting lines of poetry, prepared her for a future she could not name but must have sensed. And so her childhood closed much as it had begun, with the quiet certainty that survival depended on patience more than force. The marble city continued its routines. The Senate met, markets opened and closed. Agrippina watched, listened, and waited. What thoughts passed through her mind as she entered her first arranged marriage a few years later? Did she imagine that these early lessons, the cool floors, the long journeys, the careful silences, would one day help her guide a son to an imperial throne? Or did she, like so many young Romans, simply accept the slow, inevitable turning of family duty? You can picture Agrippina again, a few years older, moving through the slow rhythm of Rome after her father's death. Her childhood had been shaped by travel and by loss. Now, as she entered her teenage years, she became known above all as the daughter of Germanicus. The name carried weight that followed her through every corridor of the city. Germanicus had been a soldier first, but also a symbol. The people of Rome loved him for reasons that were almost ordinary. He marched with his troops, endured their weather, and spoke to them without excessive ceremony. When he died in the east, many believed he had been poisoned, and suspicion lingered like the smell of damp stone after rain. For his children, that suspicion meant constant attention. Each step they took in the forum, each small gesture at a public festival, reminded observers of a lost hero and of a dynasty still balancing on a narrow ledge. Agrippina's days unfolded in a measured pattern. At dawn, a household slave would draw back the shutters to let in the cool air of early morning. The faint sound of water carried from a nearby fountain. Breakfast was simple: bread, cheese, perhaps a fig if the season allowed. Then came lessons. Her Greek tutor, an older man with a patient voice, guided her through Homer's lines, the syllables falling like slow drops of water. Another instructor read from the speeches of Cicero, pausing to explain each turn of phrase. The aim was not brilliance for its own sake, but preparation. A woman of rank needed to read contracts, compose letters, and follow the subtleties of politics. Life in the household of her mother, Agrippina the Elder, remained busy but not grand. The family possessed wealth, estates scattered across Italy, revenue from farms and tenants, but daily management required endless attention. Account books had to be balanced. Letters from estate managers arrived sealed with wax and needed replies. Slaves and freedmen carried messages to and from the forum, reporting prices of grain and the progress of legal disputes. The dullness of these tasks masked their importance. In a society where property meant influence, careful accounting was as powerful as a senator's speech. Public appearances were unavoidable. On festival days, Agrippina and her siblings joined the processions through the city. They wore tunics of fine wool, dyed in soft colors that signaled rank without ostentation. Crowds watched as they passed along the Via Sacra toward the Capitoline Hill, whispering about the children of Germanicus. The slow pace of such rituals, pauses at each temple, formal prayers recited in a measured monotone, taught patience more than excitement. For a young girl, it was another lesson in the quiet endurance that Roman public life required. Politics, though rarely spoken of in the open, threaded through their home like a steady undercurrent. Emperor Tiberius remained suspicious of any potential rival. The name of Sejanus, the powerful Praetorian prefect, often arrived in conversation like a warning. Agrippina the Elder maintained a careful stance, respectful of the emperor, but protective of her children's future. Letters from allies were read aloud in the atrium, their words chosen with meticulous care. The young Agrippina listened and learned that meaning could hide behind a single turn of phrase. Marriage prospects soon entered the discussion. Among Rome's elite, Such arrangements were as much about property and alliance as about companionship. Relatives debated dowries, ancestry, and the subtle politics of family ties. For Agrippina, these conversations were not abstract. She knew that her eventual marriage would decide not only her personal life but her place in the ongoing struggle for influence. Still, the process unfolded slowly. Negotiations in Rome were deliberate. Letters exchanged, genealogies reviewed, omens considered. Months could pass before a decision approached. Outside the family home, the city maintained its own calm routine. Markets opened with the first light. Fishmongers shouted prices along the Tiber. Artisans hammered bronze and shaped stone in workshops that had stood for generations. The Senate met, debated, and adjourned in the same measured fashion it had for centuries. To walk through the forum was to feel time stretch, not rush. Agrippina's life moved to that same rhythm. Slow steps, steady observation, and education in persistence. The memory of her father remained a constant presence. In the public mind, Germanicus had been the very image of Roman virtue. Poets composed verses in his honor. Citizens left small offerings at statues erected along the streets. For Agrippina and her siblings, this reverence brought both pride and unease. They were honored for their bloodline, but also watched for any sign of ambition. A careless remark could travel through the city faster than a courier's horse. When Agrippina entered her mid-teens, her first formal betrothal was arranged. The chosen match was Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a man of consular rank with family connections stretching back to the Old Republic. The decision was less about affection than about weaving another thread into the Julio-Claudian web. The preparations themselves became part of her daily life. Consultations with legal advisors, the drawing up of dowry documents, the selection of household items to accompany her to her future husband's home. Each step required attention to detail, the exact weight of silver vessels, the number of attendants to be transferred, the ceremonial wording of contracts. The marriage took place when Agrippina was around 13 or 14, an age considered suitable among the Roman elite. The ceremony followed custom. On the appointed day, friends and relatives gathered as witnesses. Agrippina wore a flame-colored veil and a belt tied with the so-called knot of Hercules, a symbol of fertility. Vows were spoken in a formal, almost bureaucratic language. Bread was broken as an offering to household gods. Afterward, a quiet meal was shared, more dignified than festive. Marriage in Rome, especially among the powerful, was an act of administration as much as of union. Life in her new household was steady rather than dramatic. The home of Gnaeus Domitius stood near the Palatine, close enough to the heart of government to remain convenient but not ostentatious. Agrippina's duties included managing domestic staff, overseeing the storage of grain and oil, and maintaining the social ties expected of a senator's wife. These tasks were repetitive and practical. She reviewed accounts, supervised the spinning of wool, and ensured that religious rituals were performed on the proper days. Evenings often ended with quiet dinners where conversation touched on politics but rarely raised voices. Through these years, the broader empire continued its patient work. Roads were repaired, aqueducts maintained, taxes collected from provinces stretching across 3 continents. Messengers arrived from Spain with reports of harvest yields, from Egypt with updates on grain shipments. The machinery of Rome turned at a pace that was deliberate, even when events seemed urgent. Agrippina lived within that tempo, her private concerns woven into the larger fabric of imperial administration. Around the year 37, when Agrippina was about 22, her brother Gaius, known to the soldiers as Caligula, became emperor. The transition of power, like so many in Rome, was a matter of paperwork and ceremony. Decrees signed, oaths renewed, statues draped in fresh garlands. For Agrippina, the change meant a new layer of attention. As the sister of the emperor, she gained a place in the public eye once again. Yet the role demanded caution. Caligula's rule began with generous promises but soon revealed a sharp edge. Whispers of erratic behavior and sudden punishments circulated through the city. Her position at court required endless small duties. She attended public games, participated in formal sacrifices, and stood beside her sisters during imperial ceremonies. Each appearance followed a set pattern: arrival in procession, greetings to officials, offerings at altars. The repetition could lull the mind, but every gesture carried meaning. A misplaced glance or an unintended word could spark rumor. Agrippina learned to maintain a composed stillness, a skill that would later serve her in far more dangerous circumstances. Daily life in the imperial household was not one of constant drama but of scheduled tasks and quiet surveillance. Servants moved through corridors carrying messages and trays of food. Officials presented petitions in carefully scripted language. The smell of incense mixed with the faint metallic scent of bronze doors warmed by the sun. Agrippina, now a young woman, watched and listened. Her education in patience and subtlety deepened. By the late 30s CE, tension within the family grew. Caligula's unpredictability and the shifting alliances of court politics placed everyone under quiet strain. Rumors of plots circulated, as they always did in Rome, but life continued in its measured way. Morning audiences, afternoon legal business, evening banquets where musicians played soft notes and guests reclined on couches of polished wood. For Agrippina, these years were both uneventful and formative. She had become the steady observer, a woman who could navigate ceremony, manage estates, and remain silent when silence was safest. Her childhood lessons, the slow journeys, the careful study of words, the endless small tasks of household administration, had prepared her well. And yet, as she walked each day through the marble halls of her brother's palace, she must have sensed that the quiet surface could not last forever. Caligula's temper was quick, and his suspicions grew. How long could a family, however carefully poised, survive the subtle dangers of imperial favor? The question lingered like the echo of footsteps in a long corridor, waiting for the next turn of events. By the year 37 CE, Agrippina the Younger had already experienced the quiet repetition of duties expected of a Roman matron. Her marriage to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus had settled into a routine that would have felt ordinary to many women of her rank, even as the marble world of the imperial household changed around them. The house of the Domitii stood on a slope not far from the Palatine. It was neither the grandest residence in Rome nor the humblest. Courtyards held citrus trees trimmed with careful symmetry. Rainwater collected in the central impluvium, a small square pool that reflected the pale sky. Servants swept the stone floors each morning before the household stirred. The rhythm of life followed the same pattern day after day. Dawn prayers to the household gods, simple breakfast bread, the low murmur of slaves moving between storerooms. Agrippina's responsibilities were practical. She oversaw inventories of grain and oil, confirmed deliveries from rural estates, and kept watch over the accounts that recorded rents and taxes. A scribe sat with her at a long wooden table, reading aloud the figures as she checked each entry. A miscount of amphorae or a missing signature might seem trivial, but property defined status, and accuracy meant security. These were quiet tasks, but in the careful order of Roman society, they carried real weight. Her husband, Gnaeus Domitius, came from an old patrician line known more for endurance than brilliance. He served as praetor and later as consul, positions that demanded attendance at Senate sessions, hearings of legal petitions, and the dull but necessary rituals of civic life. Agrippina often joined him for formal dinners with colleagues or allied families. Such evenings unfolded slowly, guests reclining on couches, courses of fish and lentils served with deliberate ceremony, conversation drifting from provincial grain yields to rumors of legislation. Politics, like the meal itself, moved at a measured pace. When not engaged in public obligations, Agrippina supervised the training of household slaves and the education of young freedmen who managed the family's rural estates. She approved purchases of wool and linen, discussed repairs to farm equipment, and kept a close eye on the seasonal work of planting and harvest. These concerns might sound unremarkable, yet the stability of a Roman aristocratic family depended on precisely this kind of daily attention. Even the smallest lapse could invite dispute over property or a challenge to inheritance. The broader empire remained busy in its own patient way. Couriers arrived from Spain with reports on olive harvests. From the east came news of minor disturbances along the frontier. Such information entered Rome through official channels, was copied onto wax tablets, and eventually reached households like Agrippina's, where it became the subject of evening discussion. The slow passage of news reminded everyone that the empire was vast but tightly bound by roads, laws, and routine. In these years, Agrippina gave birth to a son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, known later as Nero. The event, like most Roman births, was both intimate and public. Midwives prepared the birthing chamber with warm water and clean cloths. A household slave was sent to fetch a physician in case of difficulty. After the delivery, a family member placed the infant on the floor before the father, who symbolically lifted the child to acknowledge him as legitimate. Neighbors and relatives offered small gifts of oil or silver coins. The ceremony was simple, but it signaled the continuation of lineage, a matter of deep importance to Roman families. Daily life with a newborn followed a quiet pattern. Nurses attended the child, feeding and swaddling him, while Agrippina resumed her responsibilities within weeks. Letters to estate managers still required answers. Religious festivals still demanded offerings at the household altar. Motherhood added to her duties rather than replacing them. Evenings might end with the soft sound of a child sleeping while the household accountant recited lists of expenses. While Agrippina settled into these domestic rhythms, her brother Caligula's reign began to darken. At first, the city had greeted him with almost extravagant joy, games, feasts, generous gifts to the populace. But as seasons turned, whispers of cruelty and sudden executions spread. The Praetorian Guard moved more visibly through the streets. Officials who only months before had enjoyed imperial favor now faced quiet exile or worse. For Agrippina and her sisters, whose position at court required regular attendance, caution became second nature. Visits to the palace were formal affairs. She would arrive in a covered litter, accompanied by attendants, and proceed through marble corridors smelling faintly of incense and polished bronze. Imperial banquets unfolded with choreographed elegance. Musicians played low melodies, servants presented carefully timed courses, and conversation stayed within the bounds of ritual. Beneath the polished surface, tension hummed. Guests spoke with deliberate care, weighing each phrase. Agrippina, already trained in the art of quiet observation, learned to read small signals, a sudden silence, a glance between officials that might indicate favor or danger. Her marriage offered little refuge from the currents of politics. Gnaeus Domitius maintained his senatorial duties but had limited influence at the highest level. The couple's conversations in the evening, after the household had gone still, often touched on the unpredictable temper of the emperor. They discussed, too, the security of their estates and the legal protections that might ensure their son's inheritance should the political climate turn against them. Such discussions were not dramatic. They were the practical calculations of survival. In the year 39, events at court became more perilous. Caligula, increasingly suspicious of plots, ordered the arrest of several prominent figures, including his own sisters. Agrippina was accused of involvement in a conspiracy, an accusation based more on rumor than evidence, but enough to bring exile. The decree arrived not with shouts or sudden violence, but in a formal written order carried by an imperial officer. She was given little time to prepare, only enough to gather essential belongings and a few attendants. Exile to the island of Pontia was a slow process. A small coastal vessel carried her across the Tyrrhenian Sea. The journey itself offered little comfort. The smell of salt and tar, the rhythmic creak of oars, the endless horizon of gray water. Days passed in near silence, broken only by the call of seabirds and the splash of waves against the hull. Agrippina, accustomed to the steady routines of household management, now faced a different kind of routine, one defined by isolation. The island was small, windswept, and sparsely inhabited. Her quarters were simple: stone walls, a roof of rough tile, a hearth that smoked when the wind shifted. Supplies arrived at intervals determined by weather and imperial whim. A few loyal attendants helped her maintain a semblance of order, collecting rainwater, repairing clothing, preparing the modest meals of fish, grain, and olives that the island provided. Days blurred into one another, marked by the movement of the sun and the changing sound of the sea. Even in exile, Agrippina preserved habits of discipline. She kept a small library of scrolls, read aloud to her attendants, and maintained records of household accounts as if she still managed estates in the city. Letters to her mother and to trusted allies were written in careful, neutral language, mindful that imperial agents might read every line. The act of writing itself, a deliberate shaping of words on wax tablets, offered a sense of continuity when the future was uncertain. Back in Rome, the empire continued its patient work. Senators debated grain prices. Builders repaired aqueducts. Merchants from the east brought spices and silk to the docks at Ostia. The machinery of government moved forward, indifferent to the quiet lives changed by a single decree of exile. For Agrippina, each passing month was another exercise in endurance, a reminder that survival often depended less on force than on the capacity to wait. Her son Nero remained in the care of relatives during this period, a separation that must have weighed heavily but was accepted with Roman practicality. Visits were impossible. News of his growth reached her only through rare letters, carried by sailors or merchants when weather allowed. Each message was a small reassurance that the life she had built still existed beyond the sea. After nearly 2 years, the tide of politics shifted again. Caligula's assassination in early 41 CE brought an abrupt end to her exile. The order for her return arrived with the same formal simplicity as the decree that had banished her. Once more she boarded a vessel, this time heading back toward the familiar coast of Italy. The journey, though welcome, was as slow as the first days of rolling waves, nights under a clear but indifferent sky. When Agrippina set foot again on the mainland, she resumed the routines of Roman aristocratic life almost seamlessly. Her first tasks were practical: reclaiming property, re-establishing contact with estate managers, ensuring that legal rights remained intact after years of absence. The work required careful documentation and patient negotiation, but she approached it with the steady composure learned through years of quiet discipline. The city she returned to had changed little in appearance. Markets still opened at dawn. The Senate still met in slow deliberation. The same marble temples caught the afternoon sun. What had changed was Agrippina herself. She had endured exile, managed separation from her child, and returned with the knowledge that survival depended on attention to every small detail. And so, as Rome settled into yet another imperial transition under the new Emperor Claudius, Agrippina stepped back into the measured routines of domestic and political life. Her early lessons, careful speech, precise record-keeping, the patience to endure both fortune and misfortune, remained her constant companions. Yet the question lingered: how would she use these skills in a city where power shifted like the slow current of the Tiber? The answer waited in the deliberate steps of the years to come, as alliances formed and opportunities quietly unfolded. The year 41 CE opened with the steady clatter of hooves on Rome's stone streets and the slow, deliberate turning of imperial power. Gaius, known to the soldiers as Caligula, was dead, struck down by the Praetorian Guard after less than 4 years on the throne. For most Romans, the assassination was another event to note on a wax tablet before returning to the day's tasks. For Agrippina, newly returned from exile, It meant a cautious re-entry into the complex life of the imperial family. The Senate deliberated for hours after the killing, voices rising and falling in the cavernous curia. Meanwhile, the city's routines continued almost untouched. Bakers kneaded dough before dawn, fishmongers shouted prices by the Tiber, and children carried water from public fountains. Even in crisis, Rome moved at its customary pace. Agrippina stepped into this atmosphere of careful normalcy, knowing that her name, sister to the murdered emperor, still carried both privilege and risk. Her immediate concern was the quiet restoration of her rights. Years of exile had left properties to reclaim and accounts to reconcile. She met with legal advisors in cool, shaded atria, listening as they recited the formulas required to confirm ownership of estates and the guardianship arrangements for her young son. The work was not glamorous. Rows of figures, seals of red wax, signatures in the practiced hand of a scribe. But these tedious steps secured the foundation of her family's survival. Within weeks, Rome accepted a new emperor. Claudius, uncle to both Agrippina and Caligula, was proclaimed princeps. The transition brought fresh ceremonies, offerings at the Capitoline Temple, oaths of loyalty from senators, public games announced on wooden placards across the forum. Agrippina attended many of these events, her presence a visible sign that the Julio-Claudian line remained unbroken. She arrived in a curtained litter, dressed in the pale shades considered proper for imperial women, her expression calm and unreadable. Life in Claudius' court moved with the slow rhythm of administration. Mornings began with petitions from provincial governors and reports from military commanders. Afternoons were filled with receptions, dinners, and the small but precise rituals that signaled imperial favor. Agrippina participated when required, greeting officials, offering the correct formal words, and observing the endless details of ceremony. The measured pace of processions, the correct order of salutations, the positioning of cushions and lamps in audience chambers. Every gesture mattered, though none seemed dramatic. Her experience as Caligula's sister gave her an unusual perspective. She had witnessed the swift rise of an adored young emperor and the equally swift collapse of his rule. She knew how easily popularity could sour, how quickly an emperor's allies could become suspects. At dinners in Claudius' palace, as musicians played soft notes and servants moved silently with platters of olives and figs, Agrippina observed more than she spoke. Her years of exile had taught her that silence could be a form of influence. The city itself provided a steady backdrop to these cautious maneuvers. The aqueducts carried clear water across miles of countryside. Street vendors sold chickpea stew to laborers repairing temples blackened by decades of smoke. Children practiced their letters on wax tablets while older men debated grain prices in shaded porticos. The great machine of Rome continued its work, indifferent to the anxieties of any single family. In private, Agrippina devoted herself to her son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. Now a small boy, he was educated in the standard pattern for a patrician child. Lessons in reading and writing, recitations of Homer, and careful instruction in the duties of a Roman citizen. Agrippina oversaw these sessions with quiet diligence, selecting tutors known for patience rather than brilliance. She kept household records with the same precision she brought to her son's upbringing, ensuring that he would inherit not only property but the habits of order and endurance. Relations with her husband, Gnaeus Domitius, remained steady but unremarkable. He continued his senatorial duties, attending debates that often stretched late into the evening, while she managed the daily flow of the household. They shared quiet meals of lentils and fish, discussed estate business, and exchanged the polite courtesies of a marriage built as much on alliance as affection. Their conversations, though undramatic, often returned to the same practical questions: the security of their property, the education of their son, and the subtle signals emerging from Claudius' new court. At imperial gatherings, Agrippina moved with the composure expected of a woman of her rank. She greeted fellow nobles with measured warmth, listened more than she spoke, and left before the evening grew loud with drink. Observers noted her poise but rarely quoted her words. She cultivated an image of dignified reserve. In the shifting world of Julio-Claudian politics, where a careless remark could echo for years, restraint was a quiet form of power. The seasons marked time in their familiar way. Spring brought festivals to honor the Great Mother, with processions of musicians and dancers moving through the city's narrow streets. Summer meant the steady heat of the Mediterranean sun, softened by the evening breeze off the Tiber. Autumn brought the grain fleets from Egypt, their arrival celebrated with offerings to the river gods. Through each cycle, Agrippina maintained her household, raised her son, and kept a watchful eye on the currents of imperial favor. Her status as Caligula's sister occasionally drew murmurs from the populace. Some remembered her brother's excesses. Others still admired the family of Germanicus. Agrippina responded with the same deliberate calm that had carried her through exile. She attended public sacrifices, supported charitable distributions of grain, and presented herself as a dutiful member of the ruling house without inviting undue attention. Yet within the palace, quiet rivalries developed. Claudius relied heavily on his freedmen, secretaries, and administrators who managed correspondence, finance, and law. Their influence shaped decisions large and small, sometimes frustrating senators who expected greater sway. Agrippina observed these dynamics closely, noting who gained favor, who withdrew, and how the slow turning of imperial bureaucracy created opportunities for those who understood its tempo. In the year 40-something, dates blurred in the long calm, her husband's health began to fail. Roman medicine offered few remedies beyond rest, dietary changes, and prayers to the household gods. Agrippina supervised the care with quiet efficiency, preparing herbal infusions, consulting physicians, and ensuring that legal documents regarding inheritance were in perfect order. The process was gradual, measured by the slow decline of strength and the equally slow progress of paperwork. Gnaeus Domitius died before the decade closed, leaving Agrippina a widow in her late 20s. The funeral followed custom. A procession through the city, eulogies spoken in formal Latin, offerings to the spirits of the dead. Afterward, she oversaw the legal confirmation of her son as heir, a task that required patience and the careful review of property lists, dowry records, and the testimony of witnesses. In Roman society, widowhood brought both vulnerability and a measure of independence. Agrippina now controlled her own finances and, more importantly, the future of her child. Throughout these years, she remained a figure of quiet resilience. Friends and rivals alike recognized her ability to maintain dignity amid the slow, grinding processes of imperial life, exile, return, widowhood without public complaint. She lived, as many Romans did, in the long spaces between dramatic events, where survival depended less on bold action than on steady attention to detail. Even as she settled into widowhood, Agrippina could not ignore the subtle changes within Claudius' household. His young son Britannicus grew under the watchful care of his mother, Messalina, whose ambitions were whispered about in shaded porticos. The emperor himself, diligent but indecisive, relied more heavily on his advisors with each passing year. These developments unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly, but Agrippina, shaped by years of observation, noticed every small shift. As another spring approached, Rome prepared for its usual festivals. Markets draped in garlands, temples washed with fresh water, processions planned with mathematical precision. Amid these familiar rituals, Agrippina remained composed, her thoughts turning always toward the careful upbringing of her son and the steady safeguarding of their position. What possibilities did she foresee as she stood in the cool shade of her courtyard, listening to the distant murmur of the forum? Did she already imagine alliances that might one day place her child at the center of empire, or did she simply attend to the next day's quiet obligations, letters to estate managers, the review of grain accounts, the endless, necessary details of survival? The answer lay ahead, in opportunities that would unfold not in sudden leaps but in the same deliberate rhythm that had guided her life from the beginning. The summons arrived without ceremony. A plain messenger, wearing the simple cloak of a palace functionary, delivered the order to Agrippina's household. There was no dramatic accusation read aloud, no crowded court or public trial. Only a sealed tablet bearing the mark of Emperor Claudius and the quiet command that she leave Rome for the small rocky island of Pontia. Exile in the Roman world was rarely a sudden spectacle. It was instead a series of mundane preparations. Agrippina's household staff, scribes, slaves, and freedmen, moved through their tasks with the brisk efficiency of people who understood the stakes. Property deeds had to be secured, legal guardians appointed for her young son, and letters sent to trusted allies. The work filled the final days in her city home with the dry scent of parchment and the scratch of stylus on wax. The island of Pontia lay just off the coast of Campania, a cluster of volcanic rock shaped by centuries of wind and salt. To the imperial court it was far enough to isolate a political inconvenience, yet near enough for periodic reports to reach Rome. Agrippina boarded the small coastal vessel before dawn. The harbor workers moved about their duties, tying ropes, stacking amphorae of grain, without giving special notice to the quiet woman escorted by a handful of guards. The sea crossing was short but restless. Autumn winds carried the smell of brine and the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull. Agrippina sat beneath a canvas awning, the horizon a line of muted blue. There was no audience to observe her composure, yet she maintained it all the same. Years of imperial life had taught her that dignity, even in solitude, was a discipline. Pontia offered little in the way of comfort. Its rocky cliffs rose steeply from the water, dotted with low shrubs and the occasional twisted pine. A small garrison occupied a cluster of stone buildings near the harbor. The dwelling assigned to Agrippina was plain. A single-room structure with a hearth, a narrow sleeping couch, and a wooden table marked by years of use. A cistern collected rainwater. The island's residents, fishermen, and a handful of soldiers went about their routines with minimal interest in their imperial guest. Daily life soon settled into a quiet rhythm. At dawn she walked the narrow paths along the cliff, the sound of the sea below a constant accompaniment. Breakfast was simple: coarse bread, olives, and watered wine. She kept her own records, using a traveling chest of wax tablets and stylus, noting the dates of shipments, the condition of her clothing, the changing patterns of the weather. These details, mundane to others, gave structure to the long days. Letters formed the lifeline to the mainland. Though all correspondence passed through imperial oversight, Agrippina wrote with careful neutrality. She inquired about her son's lessons, the management of her estates, and the health of distant relatives. Each message followed a pattern of formal greetings and precise phrasing, a style designed to reveal little beyond the necessary facts. Reply times were unpredictable. A courier might arrive after a week or after a month, depending on winds and official schedules. The island community remained small and predictable. Fishermen mended nets on the rocky shore, their conversations carried by the wind in fragments of Latin and Campanian dialect. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter at set intervals, their sandals leaving narrow trails in the gravel. Occasionally a supply ship arrived, bringing dried beans, oil, and grain. Its appearance was the most notable event of any week, the creak of timbers echoing against the cliffs long before the vessel came into view. Agrippina maintained her own discipline of mind and body. She read from the scrolls she had brought, histories of the Republic, verses of Virgil, and recited passages aloud to keep her memory sharp. She practiced small exercises at dawn, the simple stretches and walking patterns common to Roman women who valued health. The days were marked by the steady passing of light across stone walls and the measured toll of her own footsteps. Seasons changed with slow clarity. Winter winds swept the island with sharp salt air, rattling shutters and carrying the scent of distant storms. Spring softened the landscape with patches of green where hardy herbs grew in cracks of rock. Summer brought a dry brilliance to the sky, the sea below flashing like hammered bronze. Through each shift, Agrippina's habits held steady. Morning walks, midday readings, evening reflections before the small hearth. Occasional visitors broke the monotony. An officer from the mainland might arrive to inspect the garrison or deliver imperial instructions. They were polite but formal, conversations limited to weather, supply needs, and the health of the exiled noblewoman. Agrippina responded with equal restraint, offering measured thanks for each delivery of oil or grain. Her thoughts, though private, turned often to her son. Lucius remained in Rome under the guardianship of relatives, his education progressing through the standard curriculum of rhetoric and philosophy. She imagined him reciting lines of Homer, practicing the careful gestures of oratory, and learning the complex etiquette of the senatorial class. Every letter that reached her, however brief, was read and reread until the wax bore the marks of her fingers. Months stretched into years. Time on Pontia was not marked by grand events but by the repetition of small tasks. Agrippina cleaned her own garments, tended a small garden of herbs, and counted the phases of the moon. The stillness demanded patience, a quality she had cultivated long before exile. Survival here was not a test of strength but of quiet endurance. Outside the island, Rome continued its ceaseless activity. Claudius' reign moved forward with its usual administrative grind. Edicts on grain supply, repairs to aqueducts, debates in the Senate over provincial governance. News of these developments reached Agrippina only in fragments. An offhand remark from a visiting officer, a passing note in an official dispatch. The empire expanded and contracted, but on Pontia the sea remained the central fact. At times she reflected on the fate of her family. Her mother Agrippina the Elder, her father Germanicus, her brother Caligula. The Julio-Claudian line was both a privilege and a hazard, a truth reinforced by every gust of salt wind against the stones of her dwelling. Yet she did not allow bitterness to overtake her routine. The discipline of daily tasks, recording weather, tending the hearth, walking the perimeter, remained her anchor. After roughly 3 years, the pattern began to shift. Rumors reached her of changes in Rome. Political rivalries, new alliances, and quiet reconsiderations of past decisions. Messengers arrived with more frequency. One spring morning, a courier presented a sealed order bearing the imperial insignia. The exile was ended. Agrippina was permitted to return to the mainland. The departure was as understated as her arrival. She packed the same small chest of scrolls and garments, leaving the dwelling swept and orderly. The fishermen nodded polite farewells. The sea crossing back to the Campanian coast unfolded beneath a pale sky streaked with early clouds. There was no triumphant welcome waiting, only the gradual process of reintegration into a city that had never truly paused during her absence. As the mainland hills came into view, Agrippina stood at the ship's rail, the wind carrying the faint scent of olives from distant groves. She had endured the slow erosion of time, the careful accounting of days, and the quiet discipline of survival. Now the question lingered, as steady and unresolved as the tide. How would the patience learned on a barren island shape the choices she would make in the restless heart of Rome? The ship that bore Agrippina back to the mainland cut through waters faintly green with spring light. The journey itself was uneventful. A half-day's passage from the bare cliffs of Pontia to the softer curves of the Campanian coast. But each measured splash of the oars carried her closer to the dense fabric of Roman life, an empire whose rhythms had continued undisturbed during her 3 quiet years of exile. She disembarked at the harbor of Puteoli, a port accustomed to routine arrivals of grain vessels and merchant ships. No crowd greeted her, only the ordered bustle of dockworkers guiding carts, balancing amphorae of oil and wine, and calling out prices over the cries of gulls. Her escort, a single centurion and a few attendants, handed over the imperial letter that confirmed her release. The harbor official scanned the wax seal with the practiced efficiency of a man who had checked hundreds before it. Paperwork concluded. Agrippina stepped onto Roman soil again, the stones warm under a pale morning sun. The road north toward Rome followed the same route she had traveled years earlier, when exile took her in the opposite direction. Along the Via Appia, farmers tilled spring fields, and innkeepers tended to travelers with bowls of lentil stew. Mile markers stood at even intervals, their Latin inscriptions noting distances that had not changed in generations. Agrippina rode in a small covered carriage, curtains drawn against the dust. Each stop for fresh mules unfolded with unhurried precision. Coins exchanged, harnesses adjusted, the faint smell of olive oil from nearby presses drifting through the air. She entered the capital at dusk. The city's sounds, hammering from a late-working smithy, vendors calling out leftover produce, the deep toll of a temple bell, created a familiar, almost domestic chorus. Rome had grown in her absence. New warehouses lined the Tiber, and repairs to the aqueduct arches gleamed white against the fading sky. Yet the essential city remained the same. Layers of stone and custom, citizens moving according to habits older than the empire itself. Agrippina's first tasks were administrative rather than celebratory. Before she could reclaim her residence on the Celian Hill, she had to confirm her legal status as a citizen in good standing. At the aedile's office, she presented the imperial decree of recall, the clerk carefully pressing a fresh seal onto the wax tablet that recorded her name. No crowd watched, only a few other petitioners waiting with routine requests about property boundaries and street repairs. The transaction, though dry, returned to her the quiet privileges of Roman civic life. Next came the matter of property. Years of absence demanded a careful accounting of estates, tenants, and finances. Agrippina met with her stewards in the shaded atrium of a rented townhouse, reviewing lists of grain yields, rents paid, and minor disputes among tenants. The ledgers smelled faintly of smoke and oil, each line of figures a testament to 3 years of patient management by distant overseers. She approved small repairs to a villa roof near Antium, authorized the purchase of 2 new oxen for a southern estate, and dispatched letters of thanks to freedmen who had kept her affairs orderly. Reunion with her son required equal attention to detail. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, now approaching adolescence, had remained in the care of his aunt Domitia Lepida. Agrippina visited their household in a quiet, formal meeting. She embraced the boy with measured warmth and listened as his tutors recited progress in rhetoric, Greek, and the basics of Roman law. He stood straight as they reported on his handwriting and recitation, his expression composed in the manner expected of a patrician youth. Agrippina noted both his confidence and his restraint, qualities she had long valued. Life in Rome resumed with a pattern that was both familiar and subtly changed. Early mornings began with the distant rattle of wagons bringing produce into the markets. Slaves swept marble pavements with palm brooms while shopkeepers arranged figs, olives, and rolls of dyed wool. Agrippina walked the streets with 2 attendants, her cloak drawn close, pausing to observe the same city she had left. The public baths steaming in the cool air, the forum alive with advocates rehearsing arguments, the ever-present scent of bread baking in communal ovens. At court, the political climate required careful navigation. Claudius still ruled, assisted by a small circle of freedmen whose efficiency shaped imperial policy more than many senators liked to admit. His wife, Messalina, remained a dominant presence, charming in public, whispered about in private. Agrippina understood the need for discretion. She attended formal gatherings when invited, speaking politely but sparingly, her years of exile having honed the art of listening more than talking. Ceremonies marking seasonal festivals offered opportunities to reestablish her public image. During the April Games of Ceres, she appeared in the stands wearing a simple stola of pale wool, acknowledging greetings with a composed nod. At the Vestalia in June, She joined the slow procession of women carrying offerings to the temple hearth. Observers noted her presence without comment. Her return to civic life was treated not as a triumph but as a quiet restoration of order. The private hours were filled with the work of rebuilding household routines. She inspected storerooms, arranged for new linens, and reviewed the condition of gardens that had grown wild in her absence. Meals were modest. Lentils simmered with herbs, fresh bread, olives in brine. She maintained the habit of reading by lamplight, scrolls of Livy or the Stoics resting on the low cedar table beside her couch. Silence, once enforced by isolation, now became a deliberate choice. Lucius spent increasing time under her supervision. Mornings found him reciting passages from Homer, afternoons practicing the gestures of oratory with his rhetoric master. Agrippina observed these lessons with quiet satisfaction, occasionally offering a correction in the measured tones of a parent who expected diligence rather than brilliance. In the evenings they walked the peristyle garden, discussing the day's studies or the phases of the moon. These small conversations carried the weight of her hopes for his future. Outside her household, Rome's machinery of governance continued its steady work. Grain ships arrived from Egypt, their cargo carefully tallied at the river docks. Senators debated taxation in long sessions where the language of compromise flowed as predictably as the Tiber. Claudius announced repairs to the harbor at Ostia, a project requiring endless quarry orders and shipments of timber. The empire, vast and methodical, absorbed each effort with the same quiet inevitability. Agrippina's own position, while restored, remained delicate. Some senators regarded her as a potential ally, others as a remnant of Caligula's volatile reign. She offered them little to exploit. Her public words were measured, her private dealings conducted through trusted freedmen. She invested in estates producing olive oil and wine, choosing properties not for spectacle but for steady income. Each decision reflected the patience learned during exile. Build foundations first, seek influence later. Seasons turned once more. The heat of summer baked the city's stones until evening breezes from the river cooled the narrow streets. Autumn brought the arrival of the grain fleet, the scent of new wine, and festivals honoring the Capitoline Jupiter. Winter rains darkened the marble but filled the cisterns that supplied every household. Agrippina moved through these cycles with quiet regularity, her life no longer defined by the sudden orders of emperors but by the deliberate pace she set for herself. Still, the palace remained a distant center of power. Rumors reached her of Messalina's extravagances, of Claudius' reliance on his secretaries, of subtle rivalries among senators seeking the emperor's favor. Agrippina listened without visible reaction. She had learned that events at the heart of empire often shifted gradually, their true significance emerging only after many seasons. Late one evening, as she sat in the lamplight reviewing accounts from her estates, a messenger arrived with a routine invitation to an upcoming festival at the imperial gardens. It was a simple notice, one of many that circulated through noble households. Yet it marked a quiet turning point. Her presence was once again sought not out of obligation but as a natural part of Rome's social order. The long years of absence were giving way to a new phase of influence. Still subtle, still slow, but unmistakably real. Standing in the peristyle garden the next morning, she listened to the steady trickle of water from the small fountain. The city around her hummed with ordinary life, vendors bargaining, children practicing letters on wax tablets, the distant clang of metal from a smithy. Agrippina breathed the familiar air of Rome and considered the lessons of Pontia: patience, discipline, and the quiet power of endurance. What would these lessons yield in the unpredictable future? Would the habits of careful planning guide her toward alliances yet unimagined? Or would the city's restless politics test her resolve once more? The questions lingered, unanswered, as another day began in the eternal rhythm of Rome. The steady return to Roman life after exile brought with it another transition. Agrippina now stood as a widow in full legal control of her own property and the future of her young son. Her husband, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, had died quietly while she was still in exile, the news reaching her in carefully phrased letters. The years that followed her return demanded not dramatic action but the slow, deliberate management of estates, finances, and the fragile networks of family alliance that defined Roman aristocratic survival. Widowhood in the Roman world was both constraint and opportunity. The law recognized Agrippina as a sui juris woman, independent, no longer under the legal authority of a husband or father. Yet independence carried responsibilities. The supervision of properties scattered across Italy, the education of a child who now held both the Ahenobarbus name and the deeper legacy of the Julio-Claudian bloodline. Agrippina approached each duty with the same quiet discipline that had sustained her through exile. Her first months back were filled with the dry work of inheritance law. The Domitius estates stretched from the fertile plains near Arpinum to vineyards in Etruria. Each required confirmation of ownership, renewal of contracts with tenant farmers, and careful review of old debts. She spent long mornings seated at a cedar table while her steward read aloud lists of harvest yields, rental payments, and minor disputes over boundary stones. Ink-smudged tablets recorded every figure. The clatter of the city faded beyond the courtyard as she weighed decisions. A new overseer for the olive groves, a modest loan to a neighboring estate, the replacement of aging oxen. Her son, Lucius, remained the central concern. Now a boy of early adolescence, he studied rhetoric, Greek literature, and the fundamentals of Roman law under the guidance of tutors she herself selected. Agrippina insisted on a rigorous schedule. At dawn he practiced declamation, reciting passages from Homer with precise pronunciation. Midday lessons covered arithmetic and the memorization of civic rituals. Evenings brought walks in the peristyle garden where mother and son discussed the stories of Rome's founders, their conversation calm and measured beneath the rustle of cypress trees. The household itself became a model of efficient order. Freedmen managed accounts and correspondence. Slaves worked predictable rotations. Kitchen staff preparing simple meals of lentils and fish, gardeners tending to herbs and fruit trees, scribes copying letters with careful strokes of the reed pen. Agrippina oversaw every detail without visible haste. She reviewed inventories of grain, inspected the linen stores, and approved wages with a balanced hand. Visitors often remarked on the quiet precision of her home, where nothing seemed wasted and every task found its place in the day's rhythm. Outside her gates, Rome maintained its own deliberate tempo. The Forum bustled with advocates rehearsing speeches. Merchants in the Subura bargained over fabrics dyed in Tyrian purple. Engineers directed the repair of aqueduct arches. Grain fleets arrived from Alexandria, their arrival celebrated by offerings to the river gods. Agrippina moved among these routines as both participant and observer, her presence recognized but no longer sensational. She attended religious festivals, made the customary sacrifices at family tombs, and received occasional guests from old senatorial families who valued the stability of her hospitality. Wealth, though steady, demanded vigilance. Olive oil shipments had to be timed with the Mediterranean trade winds. Tenants required arbitration in disputes over irrigation rights. Letters from estate managers arrived weekly, each sealed with wax and listing weather patterns, grain prices, and the condition of livestock. Agrippina read them carefully, marking decisions in a neat, restrained hand. She avoided the conspicuous extravagance common among certain Roman elites, preferring investments that ensured long-term security over fleeting display. This deliberate lifestyle did not shield her from the shifting politics of the capital. The court of Emperor Claudius remained a center of both opportunity and danger. His wife, Valeria Messalina, was whispered to wield influence far beyond her ceremonial role. Rumors of her intrigues circulated through porticos and dinner gatherings, carried on the quiet voices of senators' wives and freedmen alike. Agrippina listened without comment. Experience had taught her that gossip often revealed more about the speaker than the subject. Still, she understood that her lineage made her a figure of interest. As the daughter of Germanicus and sister of the late Caligula, her presence at public ceremonies carried symbolic weight. When she appeared at the games in honor of Jupiter, seated among other noblewomen in the shaded stands, murmurs of recognition followed. She returned each greeting with a composed nod, neither encouraging nor discouraging attention. Her strategy remained one of quiet endurance. The seasons moved with their familiar regularity. Spring brought festivals of planting. Summer baked the city in heat softened by evening breezes from the Tiber. Autumn carried the rich scent of pressed grapes and the bustle of harvest markets. Winter rains darkened marble pavements but replenished cisterns that fed household fountains. Agrippina's household adapted to each change, storing grain, mending cloaks, arranging firewood, without drama. From time to time, she received letters from distant relatives within the Julio-Claudian circle. Some carried polite inquiries about her son's education. Others offered subtle invitations to renewed alliances. She answered each with the same measured courtesy. Formal salutations, careful phrasing, never a line that could be read as ambition or complaint. Years of navigating imperial family politics had refined her pen into a tool of both connection and restraint. As Lucius matured, the question of his future began to surface. He possessed a clear voice for oratory and a disciplined approach to study. Relatives suggested positions that might lead him toward public office, perhaps a ceremonial priesthood or early military service. Agrippina considered these options silently. The memory of her family's turbulent history tempered any thought of sudden advancement. For now, she chose patience, focusing on his education and the steady accumulation of resources that would give him choices when the time came. Evenings in the household often ended with quiet conversation beside the small courtyard fountain. Mother and son would sit while the water murmured over worn stone, discussing the day's lessons or the distant provinces of the empire. Agrippina spoke of the German frontier where her father had once commanded legions, of the trade routes that carried spices from the east, of the slow work of governors and scribes who kept the empire's vast machinery turning. Her voice remained calm, each story a reminder that history was built less on sudden violence than on persistent administration. By the middle years of the decade, Rome itself was changing. New construction projects altered familiar streets. Claudius initiated the great harbor works at Ostia to secure grain supply, a massive effort requiring quarrying, timber shipments, and countless laborers. Agrippina observed these developments during occasional visits to the Forum or the river docks, her interest practical rather than dramatic. Infrastructure, she understood, was the true foundation of imperial stability. The quiet order of her life might have continued indefinitely but for the unpredictable nature of imperial households. Messalina's ambitions grew bolder, her intrigues more public. Whispers of scandal reached even the most restrained salons. Agrippina, though distant from the palace, recognized that such turbulence could create openings as well as dangers. Her years of careful management, of estates, of reputation, of her son's upbringing, had prepared her to respond when opportunity emerged. One evening, as autumn winds stirred the cypress branches of her garden, Agrippina paused beside the fountain where lamplight rippled across the water. The city beyond the walls hummed with its usual business. Merchants closing stalls, children reciting their lessons, distant hoofbeats fading along the stone streets. She considered the slow accumulation of influence that wealth and patience afforded. Her widowhood had begun as a quiet necessity. Now it offered the means to shape the future with deliberate care. What alliances might that future require? Would her son's path be one of steady senatorial duty? Or could the intricate tides of imperial politics draw him toward something far more consequential? Agrippina did not hurry the answer. Like the careful steward of her estates, she knew that some harvests demanded years of silent cultivation before they revealed their true yield. The quiet stability of Agrippina's widowhood began to shift with subtle, almost imperceptible signals from the imperial court. Word of Messalina's growing recklessness reached even the most measured circles. Invitations to private gatherings grew more frequent, often arriving through indirect channels. A cousin of a senator, a trusted freedman of a palace official, each bearing the polite weight of curiosity. Agrippina received these messages with the same calm she applied to her estate ledgers. She read them by lamplight, noting the tone and the choice of phrasing, aware that every word might be tested later for meaning. In Rome, alliances were not forged in sudden gestures, but through a slow choreography of visits, shared meals, and discreet conversations. Agrippina approached this process as she approached all tasks, with quiet deliberation. She began accepting a select number of invitations, always choosing settings where the conversation would flow naturally and the stakes remained unspoken. Dinner at the house of a respected senator. An afternoon stroll through the porticus of Livia, where marble colonnades offered both shade and privacy. At each gathering she listened more than she spoke, her remarks carefully measured, her observations precise but never intrusive. It was during these months that she renewed contact with her uncle, the Emperor Claudius. Their meetings remained formal, carried out in the presence of other relatives or senior officials, but the tone was one of quiet recognition. Claudius, known for his scholarly habits and cautious governance, appreciated her restrained demeanor. She greeted him with the respect due to an emperor and a family elder, avoiding any suggestion of ambition. Their conversations touched on literature, the repair of aqueducts, the management of provincial grain supply, topics that allowed her to display competence without courting suspicion. Messalina, meanwhile, pursued schemes of her own. Her appetite for influence and display became the subject of increasingly open rumor. Markets buzzed with tales of her extravagance. Senators traded quiet warnings about her unpredictable maneuvers. Agrippina, seasoned by years of political observation, recognized that the palace's internal balance was tilting. The downfall of an empress was never a simple event, but the pattern of overreach and quiet resentment was familiar to anyone who had lived through the reign of Caligula. While the wider city speculated, Agrippina maintained her household's rhythm. Estate reports arrived on schedule. Her son, Lucius, now a youth approaching manhood, continued his disciplined studies. She watched with satisfaction as he delivered his first formal orations before small audiences of family friends and tutors. His voice carried clearly, his gestures controlled. After each recitation, Agrippina offered measured praise, reminding him that eloquence served not only to persuade but to conceal intention when needed. Opportunity, when it came, emerged almost quietly. Messalina's eventual exposure and downfall. A scandal that combined reckless intrigue with an ill-fated attempt at a mock marriage, shook the court but did not surprise Agrippina. She observed the news with a composure that masked careful calculation. In the aftermath, the emperor's household faced the inevitable question. Who would stand beside Claudius as empress, providing the appearance of domestic stability and, more importantly, a link to the Julian bloodline that still held symbolic power? Advisors and relatives began to weigh possibilities. Several noble women were mentioned in hushed conversations. Agrippina's name surfaced almost inevitably. Daughter of Germanicus, sister of a former emperor, mother to a boy of imperial descent. Her lineage offered both prestige and a potential heir. But such an alliance required more than family connection. It demanded an approach so careful that it could pass as natural. Agrippina did not hurry the matter. She continued her established routines, attending public festivals with dignified restraint, maintaining her estates, and guiding her son's education. When approached by those who hinted at the possibility of remarriage, she responded with polite neutrality, neither rejecting nor encouraging the idea. The pace of her replies, never too swift, never too slow, signaled both availability and caution. Claudius himself, scholars have noted, valued order above all. His reign was marked by administrative reforms, the extension of citizenship to provincial elites, the improvement of Rome's harbor at Ostia, the meticulous review of legal codes. He appreciated reliability, and Agrippina's steady management of her life made an impression. Where others sought favor through spectacle or flattery, she offered the quiet competence that matched his governing style. Their meetings grew slightly more frequent. A shared meal after a religious ceremony, a conversation in the imperial gardens about the logistics of grain transport from Egypt. Agrippina listened carefully to his observations, offering practical suggestions without presumption. She spoke of her experience managing estates and her concern for the education of her son, topics that aligned with the emperor's interests in administration and family duty. Within her own household, preparations remained subtle. She reviewed the inventories of her dowry property, ensuring that accounts were current and that her estates demonstrated profitability. She arranged for Lucius to continue his advanced studies under reputable tutors, emphasizing subjects, law, rhetoric, the history of the Republic, that would prepare him for any public role. She also maintained careful relationships with key freedmen in the imperial administration, offering small courtesies and thoughtful gifts without ostentation. Rome watched these developments with its usual mix of curiosity and caution. Market vendors repeated the latest whispers while senators discussed the potential implications in shaded porticos. Some viewed the possible union as a practical solution to the succession question. Others muttered about the concentration of Julio-Claudian blood. Agrippina remained unmoved by the speculation. Years of navigating imperial turbulence had taught her that public opinion was a tide to be acknowledged, not controlled. The formal proposal, when it finally came, followed the restrained traditions of Roman aristocracy. Relatives and trusted advisors approached her first, gauging her willingness. Claudius himself expressed his esteem in a carefully worded message that emphasized family unity and the welfare of the empire. Agrippina replied with equal formality, acknowledging the honor and the responsibilities such a union would entail. Marriage to an emperor carried both privilege and risk. She understood the history, Livia's long influence beside Augustus, the precarious fates of later empresses who misstepped. Agrippina prepared not by seeking grandeur but by reinforcing the habits that had served her so far: discipline, patience, and unyielding attention to detail. Her household underwent quiet adjustments. New arrangements for staff who would accompany her to the palace, updated accounts to ensure financial independence, the careful selection of attendants whose loyalty was proven. The wedding itself was a public event, observed by senators, equestrians, and the ordinary citizens of Rome. Ceremonial processions moved through the decorated streets. Offerings were made to the household gods. Agrippina appeared in garments of dignified simplicity, her posture composed, her expression neither exuberant nor cold. The union symbolized both the stability of the empire and the enduring power of the Julio-Claudian lineage. Life within the imperial palace introduced new layers of responsibility. Agrippina approached them as she had every previous challenge, with methodical care. She studied the routines of the household, the duties of chamberlains and secretaries, the schedules of audiences and religious rites. She identified key figures among the freedmen: Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, each of whom managed essential aspects of imperial administration. Rather than attempt immediate influence, she cultivated respectful relationships, offering counsel only when invited. Her son, now more commonly called by his family name Nero, moved into this new environment with the same discipline she had instilled from childhood. He attended public ceremonies at her side, his bearing formal, his speech precise. Agrippina ensured that his education continued uninterrupted, securing instructors who balanced philosophical inquiry with the practical skills of governance. The rhythm of palace life settled into something almost predictable. Claudius continued his administrative reforms. New roads in the provinces, legal decisions that standardized citizenship rights, the expansion of aqueducts to feed a growing city. Agrippina matched his pace, her presence a steadying influence rather than a source of spectacle. Visitors to the court noted her composure and the quiet efficiency of her household staff. Yet beneath this surface of calm, the essential question lingered. How would the careful alliance she had forged shape the future of her son and of the empire itself? Agrippina understood that influence in Rome was rarely permanent, that fortunes could shift as swiftly as the Tiber's current after a storm. Her position beside the emperor gave her unprecedented proximity to power, but it also placed her within the very center of imperial scrutiny. As she walked the shaded colonnades of the Palatine Gardens at dusk, the city below glowing with the light of countless lamps, Agrippina considered the next stage of her long, deliberate journey. Every decision, every restraint, every quiet conversation had brought her to this point. The alliance was secured, but the work of shaping its legacy had only begun. Would Claudius remain as cautious and measured as she required? Would the court accept her influence without resentment, or would old rivalries reawaken under new forms? And most pressing of all, how might she guide her son toward a future that balanced ambition with survival? The answers lay not in sudden action but in the same slow, patient cultivation that had defined her life so far. A discipline of watching, listening, and acting only when the moment proved inevitable. The palace on the Palatine Hill, with its marbled corridors and shaded gardens, settled into a measured routine after Agrippina's marriage to Claudius. Its quiet rhythms, the changing of guards at the bronze doors, the soft footfalls of scribes carrying wax tablets, the distant splash of water in courtyard fountains, suited her. Here, the deliberate pace of administration mirrored the habits she had cultivated during her years of widowhood. Yet beneath this surface order, the question of succession slowly took shape, as steady and inevitable as the Tiber's current. Claudius, cautious and book-loving, had governed the empire with a scholar's patience. But Rome always looked forward, and the empire required an heir who could command both the legions and the respect of the Senate. Claudius had a natural son, Britannicus, still a boy, and a young step-grandson through Agrippina, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, now commonly addressed by his family name, Nero. 2 boys, 2 bloodlines, and a city attuned to every gesture that might reveal imperial preference. Agrippina approached the problem not with sudden demands but with the steady accumulation of advantage. She began with visibility. Nero appeared beside her at public ceremonies, his toga of youth impeccably draped, his bow to the emperor measured but warm. At religious festivals, processions honoring Mars, sacrifices to Jupiter, mother and son stood near the imperial dais, their presence a quiet reminder of the Julian ancestry that still carried ancient prestige. Agrippina offered no speeches, only a composed figure that the crowd and the Senate could not fail to notice. Inside the palace, her method was equally deliberate. She strengthened ties with the emperor's trusted freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, through small, thoughtful courtesies. A carefully chosen gift of Greek manuscripts for Pallas, the timely dispatch of estate grain to assist Narcissus in provisioning a festival. These were gestures of respect rather than overt alliance, each one a thread in the fabric of reliability she wove around her household. Education remained central. Nero's tutors, selected with the precision of a steward balancing accounts, included the philosopher Seneca, whose measured Stoic outlook promised both intellectual discipline and political caution. Mornings began with readings of Greek tragedies, afternoons with rhetorical exercises. Agrippina insisted on regular practice of oratory, believing that a voice trained to command a room could shape Senate and populace alike. When evening lamps were lit, mother and son often walked the peristyle gardens, discussing not ambition but the structure of Roman law, the histories of the provinces, the slow work of governance. The city itself moved through its ordinary cycles. Grain fleets arrived from Alexandria, their sails crowding the harbor at Ostia. Engineers repaired the Aqua Claudia, ensuring fresh water for the sprawling metropolis. Merchants in the Forum exchanged gossip with moneylenders beneath the shadow of the Temple of Castor and Pollux. Through it all, Agrippina's presence remained calm, a constant among Rome's shifting noises. Claudius, careful in his deliberations, began to favor Nero in subtle ways. Invitations to dine, opportunities to speak at minor ceremonies, the quiet inclusion of the youth in discussions of provincial administration. Each gesture carried meaning to those who watched. Agrippina neither pressed nor boasted. She simply ensured that Nero's readiness was unmistakable. His diction polished, his demeanor respectful, his knowledge of state matters precise. In 50 CE, a decisive step arrived. Claudius adopted Nero as his son, granting him the name Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. The adoption, solemnized by Senate decree, elevated the young man to formal status as heir alongside Britannicus. The ceremony itself unfolded with Roman dignity. Senators in white-bordered togas, sacrifices offered at the Temple of Mars altar, the reading of legal formulas that echoed against marble columns. Agrippina stood with serene composure, her expression revealing nothing beyond the gravity of the moment. Adoption did not end the quiet work of consolidation. Agrippina arranged a betrothal between Nero and Octavia, Claudius's own daughter, a union that further bound the family lines. The wedding preparations unfolded over months, involving the measured negotiation of dowries, the consultation of augurs, and the careful planning of ceremonial processions. Rome watched with its usual mix of fascination and calculation, aware that each contract and sacrifice tightened the structure of succession. Within the palace, Agrippina continued her steady supervision. She reorganized household staff to ensure efficiency, appointed trustworthy stewards to oversee supplies, and kept detailed accounts of expenditures. Visitors noted the quiet order of the imperial apartments. Corridors swept clean before dawn, schedules maintained with almost military precision. The empress's personal audience hours observed like clockwork. Her presence, never ostentatious, signaled control through reliability. Beyond the walls, Rome carried on with its practical labors. Legions patrolled the Rhine frontier. Grain ships navigated the unpredictable currents of the eastern Mediterranean. Provincial governors filed their regular reports on taxes and harvests. Agrippina studied these documents when allowed, her interest not in spectacle but in the machinery of administration that sustained the empire. For her, influence meant understanding how aqueducts were maintained, how roads were surveyed, how grain quotas reached the capital. Details that kept emperors secure long after triumphal processions ended. Britannicus, younger and less seasoned, remained a presence but not a rival to be confronted openly. Agrippina maintained outward courtesy toward him and toward those senators who quietly supported his claim. She avoided any action that might seem an attack, trusting instead to the slow recognition that Nero, older and now formally adopted, possessed the experience and the maternal guidance to stand as the more obvious successor. Evenings in the palace often ended in the same gentle rhythm that had marked Agrippina's earlier years. She and Nero would walk among the laurel trees while torches flickered along the colonnades. Sometimes Seneca joined them, discussing philosophy or the duties of a ruler. The conversation rarely turned to power directly. Instead, they spoke of justice, of the temperance required in leadership, of the balance between clemency and firmness, a stoic vocabulary that masked the practical lessons of rule. By the early 50s CE, Rome largely accepted what the Senate decrees and public ceremonies had signaled. Nero was the chosen heir. The populace cheered him at games and festivals, charmed by his youthful grace and trained eloquence. Senators, cautious as ever, offered formal congratulations while quietly assessing their own positions in the emerging order. Agrippina watched these responses without outward satisfaction, her expression composed as always, her focus fixed on the ongoing tasks of administration and preparation. Yet she understood that succession in Rome was never guaranteed. Claudius was not a young man, but the health of emperors could endure unexpectedly. and politics could turn on rumor as easily as on law. She continued her methodical attention to every detail. Estate revenues, palace routines, the schooling of her son, the cultivation of allies among the freedmen and the guard. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was rushed. As summer light lingered over the Palatine gardens and the hum of the city rose from the valley below, Agrippina often paused to listen. The steady splash of the fountain, the distant cries from the Circus Maximus, the slow beat of a watchman's footsteps along the wall. Each sound reminded her that the empire's vast machinery, its aqueducts, markets, legions, and laws, was built not on sudden drama but on the quiet, unending work of maintenance. The boy she had guided from exile through careful education now stood at the threshold of imperial power. Still, questions remained like faint shadows along the marble floors. Would Claudius's health falter soon enough to secure Nero's position before rivalries hardened? Would the Senate's acceptance hold if circumstances shifted? And perhaps most delicately, could the discipline she had instilled in her son endure when the intoxicating reach of absolute power came within his grasp? Agrippina did not attempt to force answers. Her strength lay in patience, the same patience that had seen her through banishment, widowhood, and the slow construction of an alliance with an emperor. She knew that history's turning points often arrived quietly, concealed within the ordinary routines of an evening meal or a morning audience. The Palatine lamps burned late into the night as she reviewed correspondence and estate accounts, the scratch of the stylus steady against the wax. Beyond the palace walls, Rome slept, its countless citizens unaware of how much of their future rested on the silent calculations of the woman who now stood, calmly and firmly, as mother of the heir. The years that followed Nero's formal adoption unfolded with a quiet steadiness that suited Agrippina's temperament. Inside the imperial palace, daily life retained its careful rhythms. Petitions received at dawn, clerks carrying wax tablets to and from the Senate House, the measured recitation of decrees in the marble halls. Yet time moves even through marble, and the emperor's health, never robust, began to reveal the patient erosion of age. Claudius, now in his 60s, continued to attend to the machinery of empire with a scholar's diligence. He listened to provincial reports, approved new harbor works, and reviewed judicial appeals with the thoroughness of a seasoned magistrate. But those who observed him closely noticed the gradual changes. His steps along the palace colonnades slowed. The tremor in his hands, once slight, grew more visible when he lifted a scroll or gestured during debate. Even his famously careful speech occasionally faltered. A pause here, a forgotten phrase there, quickly covered by a secretary's prompt. Agrippina watched these signs with an attention that was neither hurried nor cold. Her years of managing estates and navigating imperial politics had taught her that decline seldom arrived in a single moment. It came instead as a series of small adjustments. Longer rests after Senate sessions, warmer cloaks against the evening breeze, a quiet cough behind a folded hand. She responded not with alarm but with methodical care. Meals were prepared with particular attention to his digestion. Palace physicians were consulted discreetly. The emperor's schedule was trimmed of unnecessary strain. Outside the palace, Rome continued its ceaseless motion. Merchants crowded the forum with bolts of dyed cloth and baskets of imported dates. Senators debated minor reforms in the Curia Julia, their voices echoing off marble walls. In the Subura, children played in narrow lanes while bakers stoked their ovens before dawn. The empire's vast network of roads and aqueducts carried grain, letters, and rumors with equal efficiency. Among those rumors, careful ears began to catch whispers of imperial fragility. Nero, now approaching the threshold of manhood, maintained the disciplined schedule Agrippina had long enforced. His mornings were devoted to study with Seneca. Readings from Homer, analysis of Roman legal codes, exercises in oratory that tested both voice and memory. Afternoons brought appearances at public games or religious festivals, each event a quiet rehearsal for future responsibility. Agrippina ensured that he remained visible yet restrained, a figure of promise rather than premature authority. The relationship between Nero and Britannicus required delicate management. Britannicus, younger but still the natural-born son of Claudius, retained his own circle of supporters among the aristocracy. Agrippina maintained outward courtesy toward him, instructing Nero to show the same. Public meals included both boys at the emperor's side, their togas equally well-pressed, their exchanges polite if not warm. Such displays of harmony served a practical purpose: to reassure Rome that succession would unfold without open conflict. Inside the palace, Agrippina continued to cultivate relationships with key freedmen who formed the backbone of Claudius's administration. Pallas, with his careful control of the treasury, valued her measured counsel on financial matters. Narcissus, ever wary of palace intrigue, respected her efficiency and her refusal to engage in petty disputes. These men understood that stability, both political and fiscal, was Agrippina's constant aim. Their cooperation ensured that imperial decrees and provincial supplies moved smoothly despite the emperor's increasing fatigue. Claudius himself remained aware of the succession question. During quiet conversations in the shaded garden or the library lined with scrolls, he occasionally raised the topic in guarded terms. He spoke of the empire's need for a steady hand, of the importance of education and patience in leadership. Agrippina listened without pressing her own conclusions, offering instead observations on the necessity of reliable administration and the virtue of moderation. Her words, calm and precise, reflected the stoic lessons she encouraged in Nero. Season after season, the signs of the emperor's aging grew more pronounced. Winter dampness brought lingering coughs. Summer heat left him weary after short walks. Physicians recommended herbal infusions, gentle exercise, and long rests. Claudius complied with quiet good humor, still attending to his duties but increasingly dependent on secretaries and advisors to carry the weight of daily governance. Beyond the palace walls, the empire's immense infrastructure required constant attention. Legions fortified the Rhine frontier, engineers repaired aqueduct arches, and provincial governors dispatched detailed reports on harvests and taxes. Agrippina studied these updates with the same interest she had shown in managing her own estates. She understood that the strength of Rome lay less in ceremonial display than in the unbroken maintenance of roads, waterways, and grain supply, a truth that outlasted any single ruler. Publicly, the city maintained its festivals and ceremonies. Games at the Circus Maximus drew roaring crowds. The markets of the Subura overflowed with olives, honey, and imported pepper. But perceptive citizens sensed the quiet uncertainty beneath the spectacle. Senators began to position themselves, renewing alliances or reconsidering old loyalties. Whispers spread in shaded porticos. How long would Claudius continue, and who would guide Rome when he no longer could? Agrippina neither encouraged nor denied these murmurs. She focused instead on preparation. She ensured that Nero's public appearances were frequent but never ostentatious, that his oratory continued to improve, that his demeanor conveyed both filial respect and imperial readiness. She maintained strict oversight of household accounts, ensuring that resources would remain stable no matter how swiftly events might turn. Evenings often found her in the palace library, scrolls unfurled before her, the lamps casting steady light across polished tables. Sometimes she read histories of the Republic, noting the gradual shifts of power that had shaped Rome long before her birth. Other times she simply listened to the sounds of the palace at night, the muted steps of guards on patrol, the faint trickle of a fountain in the inner courtyard, the distant call of a night watchman along the city walls. Each sound reminded her that the empire endured through structure and vigilance, not sudden drama. Claudius, for his part, remained an affectionate companion. They shared quiet meals of fish and seasonal fruit, discussing literature or the engineering of new aqueduct channels. He valued her counsel, recognizing in her the same commitment to order that guided his own policies. When illness confined him to his chambers for a day or two, Agrippina supervised the physicians with calm precision, ensuring that treatments were administered without unnecessary alarm. By the year 54 CE, the emperor's decline could no longer be dismissed as the passing weakness of age. His walks grew shorter, his need for rest more frequent. Official audiences were sometimes postponed for days at a time. Yet he persisted in his duties, signing decrees with a steady hand, reviewing provincial accounts, and offering careful judgments in legal disputes. The machinery of the empire continued, powered by the systems he and his predecessors had established. Nero, now 17, stood increasingly at the center of public attention. His speeches before the Senate, coached by Seneca, displayed clarity and restraint. Crowds cheered his appearances at festivals. Poets praised his promise. Agrippina observed these receptions without visible pride, reminding him in private that popularity was a tool to be managed, not a triumph to be celebrated. The summer of that year brought heavy, lingering heat to Rome. Even the marble of the Palatine seemed to hold the warmth of the sun long after nightfall. Claudius felt the strain. He spent more time in shaded gardens, reclining on couches while cool water trickled through nearby fountains. Physicians adjusted his diet to lighter meals of fruit and thin broth. Agrippina oversaw these changes with her customary quiet efficiency, never betraying impatience, never allowing the routines of governance to falter. As autumn approached, a subtle expectancy settled over the city. Senators spoke in guarded tones. Military commanders wrote letters more frequently. Merchants in the forum speculated about the future while weighing grain prices. Agrippina continued her patient work, ensuring that Nero remained disciplined, that alliances with key officials held firm, that the palace ran with its usual precision. Each evening, as dusk spread across the city and the Tiber reflected the fading light, Agrippina would pause in the palace gardens. The sound of water against stone blended with the distant calls of vendors closing their stalls. She understood that Rome, vast and enduring, cared little for the health of a single man. But she also knew that the transition from one emperor to the next demanded careful stewardship, and that the habits of vigilance she had cultivated over a lifetime were now more vital than ever. How long could Claudius maintain his delicate balance of duty and frailty? Would the Senate remain steady when the inevitable change arrived? And when the moment came, would the structures she had so patiently built prove strong enough to secure her son's place at the head of the empire? Agrippina did not force these answers. She continued to watch, to listen, and to prepare, aware that the quiet work of years was nearing the point where the tides of history would shift. The air of early autumn in Rome carried a faint coolness, a welcome relief after the heavy summer heat. Within the Palatine Palace, preparations for a modest celebration moved forward with deliberate ease. The occasion was the close of a series of successful provincial grain deliveries, an event significant enough to merit an imperial dinner, but hardly one to attract the city's loudest revelry. Invitations had been dispatched to a carefully chosen circle of senators, magistrates, and family. It would be a gathering of courtesy and gratitude, nothing more. Claudius greeted the plan with his customary mild approval. He had grown to prefer such restrained affairs, evenings of conversation rather than spectacle, of measured wine rather than prolonged feasting. The emperor's health, though outwardly steady, no longer encouraged long nights. Yet he agreed to the dinner, perhaps because routine itself brought comfort. It was to be held in the palace's smaller triclinium, a chamber with polished marble floors and painted panels depicting calm scenes of country harvests. Agrippina oversaw the arrangements with her usual precision. Tables of polished cedar were set low, surrounded by couches layered in muted fabrics. Bronze lamps, trimmed and filled with fresh oil, would cast a steady golden light. The menu favored simplicity. Tender fish from the Tiber, olives from the Sabine Hills, bread from the latest harvest, and a selection of mild wines. She instructed the kitchen to avoid heavy sauces and to keep portions modest, mindful of the emperor's digestion. To the staff, these were ordinary instructions, the sort she gave for every formal meal. Nero, now in the first flush of full adulthood, prepared for the evening as well. His tutor Seneca reminded him that such gatherings were opportunities for quiet demonstration, respectful attentiveness, a well-placed observation on literature or the provinces, a calm presence beside his mother and stepfather. Nero listened, adjusting the folds of his toga with care. Though still shy of complete authority, he carried himself with a poise that reflected years of measured training. As dusk fell, guests arrived through the colonnaded entrance. They were greeted by the soft murmur of fountains and the faint scent of cedar smoke. Senators of long experience, provincial governors in Rome for consultations, and a handful of trusted freedmen exchanged restrained courtesies. There was no sense of impending change, only the quiet hum of imperial routine. Claudius entered last, leaning slightly on an ivory-topped staff. The emperor's expression was serene, his gait slower than in earlier years but still dignified. He offered a few brief words of welcome, thanking those present for their service to the city and the empire. His voice carried the familiar hesitation of his speech, a cadence that those near him found oddly reassuring. Guests bowed and took their places as musicians began a low, steady melody. The meal unfolded with unhurried grace. Platters of fruit and warm bread appeared first, followed by delicately seasoned fish and roasted vegetables. Wine was poured sparingly. The emperor preferred it diluted, and the custom spread among the guests. Conversation turned to the reliability of grain shipments from Africa, the repair of a distant aqueduct, the condition of the Via Flaminia after the recent rains. To an outside observer, it might have seemed an evening of small talk and administrative detail, but to those who governed Rome, such matters were the very foundation of power. Agrippina listened as Claudius discussed a new port project at Ostia. She contributed occasional observations about the efficiency of harbor inspections and the need for careful oversight of grain measures. Her tone was even, her words practical. When servants refreshed the lamps, she noted without distraction how the golden light softened the lines of her husband's aging face. As the courses proceeded, Claudius appeared content. He praised the fish, complimented the bread's texture, and exchanged quiet remarks with a visiting senator about the merits of various provincial governors. Only once did he pause for a cough, a brief spasm quickly covered by a sip of diluted wine. Agrippina's gaze lingered on him for a moment, then returned to her own plate. Toward the end of the evening, musicians played a slow hymn in honor of the household gods. Guests reclined more comfortably, conversation easing into recollections of travel, of childhood homes along distant rivers, of the subtle differences in olive harvests from one region to another. The emperor listened with the faint smile of a man who had traveled much of the known world through reports and letters, if not always in person. When the final dishes of fruit and honey were cleared, Claudius thanked those assembled for their loyalty. He spoke briefly of Rome's enduring strength, of the importance of steady governance beyond the life of any one ruler. His words carried the weight of quiet reflection rather than prophecy. The guests, respectful and attentive, inclined their heads. The dinner concluded without spectacle, the assembly dispersing slowly into the cool night air. After the guests departed, Claudius retired to his private chambers. There, attendants assisted him with the evening's final routines: the removal of ceremonial garments, the washing of hands and face, the preparation of a mild herbal drink intended to soothe the stomach after a long meal. He settled onto his couch with a scroll of historical records, as he often did, finding comfort in the recitation of past events. The lamps burned low. Agrippina lingered in the corridor, offering quiet instructions to the household staff. She confirmed that the kitchens were cleaned, the corridors secured, and the night watch set along the palace perimeter. Her movements were deliberate, neither hurried nor hesitant. When all was in order, she withdrew to her own chambers, the sound of her steps fading into the hush of midnight. Beyond the palace walls, Rome lay under a soft, moonlit sky. Merchants in the Forum shuttered their stalls. Fishermen along the Tiber checked their nets for the morning catch. The city's countless fountains continued their measured flow, the sound mingling with the distant calls of the night watch. Nothing about the scene suggested that history was bending toward a turning point. In the hours that followed, Claudius experienced a sudden discomfort. Servants summoned physicians, who administered traditional remedies, warm compresses, diluted wine, small draughts of medicinal herbs. The emperor, though weakened, remained lucid, offering occasional directions and even a faint smile of reassurance. The palace maintained its quiet order, lamps replenished, corridors kept clear for the physician's passage. By dawn, his condition had not improved. Messengers were dispatched to key officials, who arrived in subdued haste. Agrippina remained composed, overseeing the care with the same measured calm she had shown in every aspect of palace life. Her voice remained steady as she consulted with the physicians, her attention fixed on the practical needs of the moment. Throughout the day, senators and freedmen moved quietly through the palace, offering counsel, ensuring that the machinery of government did not falter. Nero, guided by Seneca, presented himself to the household staff and key advisors, speaking words of respect and stability. Britannicus, younger and visibly anxious, remained close to his tutors, his presence a reminder of the succession questions that still hovered. Outside, the city carried on. Markets opened, children played in courtyards, and the endless flow of goods along the Tiber continued as always. Most citizens remained unaware of the emperor's illness, the palace keeping its customary silence in matters of imperial health. Evening approached again, the second after the banquet. Claudius rested under the careful attention of his physicians. The empire waited in quiet suspension, the future of its leadership poised on the edge of an outcome that could not be hurried. How long could the emperor's strength hold? Would the carefully maintained balance of power endure the uncertainty of the coming hours? And when the final decision of fate arrived, who would guide Rome through the threshold that separated one reign from the next? The lamps were lit once more, their glow steady against the deepening dusk, as the palace kept its quiet vigil. Morning broke softly over Rome. The first light of day crept across the tiled roofs and colonnaded courtyards, turning the marble of the Palatine a pale gold. In the imperial palace, the usual stirrings of activity. Servants carrying water jars, scribes unrolling the day's documents, were muted. A quiet awareness hung over the household. The emperor had not risen. Claudius lay in his chamber, breathing evenly but with a weight that spoke of exhaustion more than rest. The night's discomfort had eased into a heavy stillness. Physicians entered at intervals, checking his pulse, adjusting the herbal poultices placed on his chest. They moved with the measured pace of men who understood the limits of their craft. Warm compresses, diluted wine, and infusions of fennel and honey were all that tradition could offer. Agrippina sat nearby, her posture calm, her gaze steady. She asked for updates in a quiet voice, neither interrupting nor rushing the attendants. To those who observed her, she seemed the model of Roman discipline. Attentive but not anxious, focused on what could be done rather than on fears that could not be answered. She had lived long enough to know that illness often followed its own slow course, indifferent to will or rank. Outside the chamber, the palace continued its subdued routine. The Praetorian Guard maintained their posts along the corridors, their polished armor catching the dim morning light. Secretaries waited in the adjacent hall with scrolls of routine reports. Grain deliveries from Africa, a petition from the governor of Hispania, a request for funds to repair a collapsed bridge near Capua. All would remain unread for the moment. Nero arrived quietly with Seneca. The young heir's face was composed, though the slight tension in his jaw betrayed the weight of expectation. He greeted the physicians respectfully and stood near his mother, offering the formal courtesies of a Roman son to an ailing stepfather. Britannicus, younger and more visibly troubled, entered soon after, accompanied by his tutors. He kept a cautious distance, his eyes fixed on the emperor with a mix of fear and hope. As the morning hours passed, the city beyond the palace walls stirred to life. Merchants in the forum opened their stalls, the smell of fresh bread and olives drifting through the streets. Citizens queued at public fountains for water. Messengers set out along the great roads carrying official letters and private news. Most of Rome remained unaware that its emperor lay between life and death. Within the palace, the rhythm of watchfulness continued. Agrippina ensured that the household staff maintained order. Meals for attendants, fresh linens, regular updates to the Praetorian prefect. Her instructions were precise but never hurried. Every detail of palace management, from the replacement of spent oil lamps to the careful control of who entered the sick room, passed through her quiet direction. Claudius stirred only occasionally. At one point he opened his eyes and looked toward Agrippina, murmuring a few words too faint to carry beyond her ear. She leaned closer, replying in the same low tone. Observers could not hear the exchange, but they saw the emperor's faint nod before he closed his eyes once more. The moment passed without comment. By midday the physicians conferred in hushed Latin near the doorway. They spoke of humors out of balance, of the persistent weakness of the heart, of the natural limits of age. No single remedy, they agreed, would restore the emperor's strength. They continued their ministrations: warm cloths, gentle massage, light sips of honeyed water, more to comfort than to cure. Nero remained at his mother's side, offering short, deliberate answers when addressed by the freedmen who managed the imperial records. Seneca, ever watchful, quietly reminded him of the importance of composure. Public demeanor in such moments could shape the acceptance of future authority as surely as any decree. In the early afternoon, the sky dimmed briefly as a passing cloud drifted across the sun. The faint change of light in the sick room seemed to deepen the silence. Agrippina stood and walked to the window, looking out across the city where the Tiber curved in its slow, unbroken flow. The river, constant and indifferent, reflected the pale shimmer of day. She turned back to the chamber, her expression unchanged. Claudius's breathing grew shallower as the hours moved on. The physicians continued their quiet attendance, but the rhythm of their actions slowed. It was evident to all present that the emperor's life was approaching its natural conclusion. No cries of alarm, no dramatic pronouncements broke the stillness. Rome had long understood that even its rulers were subject to the same finite cycle as every citizen. As evening approached, lamps were lit in the hallways and the faint scent of olive oil filled the air. Messengers carried discreet notices to a small circle of senators and military commanders, advising them to remain within reach of the Palatine. The city outside remained busy with the ordinary transactions of commerce and conversation, unaware that a transition in leadership was quietly beginning. Shortly after nightfall, Claudius exhaled a final, gentle breath. The physicians confirmed what the stillness already proclaimed. They stepped back, heads bowed, as Agrippina stood in composed silence beside the couch. She placed a hand lightly on the emperor's arm, neither lingering nor withdrawing too quickly, a gesture of respect to a husband and to a ruler who had guided Rome through years of careful administration. Word spread through the palace with measured speed. The Praetorian Guard tightened their watch, ensuring that no disorder disturbed the transition. Key freedmen conferred in low voices, reviewing the procedures that custom required: the safeguarding of documents, the notification of the Senate, the quiet alert to provincial governors. Agrippina remained a steady presence. She offered brief instructions to the staff, directed that the emperor's body be prepared according to tradition, and reminded those present that the empire's stability depended on calm. Her voice never rose, Her manner suggested continuity rather than rupture. Nero stood beside her, his youthful face solemn in the lamplight. Seneca placed a discreet hand on his shoulder, signaling both comfort and guidance. The young heir spoke only a few words, affirming respect for the memory of Claudius and the importance of orderly governance. Britannicus, eyes lowered, murmured a prayer taught to him by his tutors. Outside, the moon rose over the city. The Tiber reflected its pale light as barges drifted silently beneath the arches of the bridges. Citizens slept unaware, the ordinary sounds of night, distant dogs, the creak of cart wheels on cobblestone, carrying across the quiet streets. Within the palace, preparations for the next day began even as the night deepened. Messages were drafted to the Senate, informing them of the emperor's passing. Orders were given to the Praetorian Guard to maintain a visible yet calm presence in the forum at dawn. Every action followed the well-worn procedures of imperial succession, honed through decades of precedent. Agrippina withdrew for a brief moment to the private garden. She stood among the laurel trees, the cool air carrying the faint scent of damp earth. Above, the stars stretched across the sky in quiet permanence. The empire she had worked so carefully to shape would awaken to a new chapter with the coming sun. She knew that her own vigilance had not ended. It had merely entered its most delicate phase. Would the Senate accept the transition without dispute? Would the Praetorian Guard remain loyal as the morning's announcements spread through the city? And would the careful balance she had cultivated around Nero hold firm when the wider empire learned that Claudius was no more? These questions lingered in the night air as Agrippina returned to the lamplit corridors of the palace. The dawn would bring answers, but for the moment, Rome lay suspended between an emperor's final breath and the first stirrings of a new reign. The first light of morning crept over the Palatine Hill, washing the marble walls of the imperial palace in a pale, cool glow. The city beyond the palace stirred with its ordinary sounds, vendors lifting wooden shutters, the distant clatter of wagon wheels on stone. But inside the imperial compound, the air carried a different weight. Rome was waking to a day without Claudius. Agrippina rose before dawn. The night's vigil had left no mark on her posture or expression. She moved through the quiet corridors with steady steps, her dark cloak drawn close against the early chill. Servants bowed as she passed, their movements subdued. They, too, sensed that this day required a special kind of order. In the emperor's private chamber, attendants prepared the body according to custom. They washed Claudius with water drawn from the Tiber, anointed him with oils, and wrapped him in the white garments reserved for imperial rites. The room smelled faintly of cedar and myrrh. Agrippina entered only briefly, offering a silent nod of respect before continuing to the council chamber where the business of succession would begin. The Praetorian Guard had been alert through the night. At first light, their centurions stationed men at the main gates and key intersections of the city. Their polished armor caught the morning sun as they moved with deliberate calm. The display was not merely ceremonial. It reassured the citizens that Rome's defenses and discipline remained unbroken. Nero, newly 17, stood with Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus in an adjoining hall. He wore a simple white toga with a purple border, his expression composed but pale. Seneca, the philosopher-statesman who had guided his education, spoke to him in low tones, emphasizing restraint and the value of measured speech. Burrus, the seasoned soldier whose loyalty would be vital, nodded in agreement. Both men understood that the young heir's demeanor on this day would shape the acceptance of his rule as surely as any decree. Agrippina entered the chamber, her eyes meeting her son's with a brief, steady glance. She offered no words of comfort or triumph. Instead, she gave concise instructions. The Senate must be informed immediately. The Guard must be addressed with respect and gratitude. The people of Rome must hear of a seamless transition. Nero listened carefully, his voice quiet as he repeated the steps back to her. as though rehearsing a carefully crafted speech. Shortly after sunrise, a messenger carried the formal announcement to the Senate. Emperor Tiberius Claudius Caesar had died in the night, and the designated heir, Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, awaited their acknowledgement. The Senate, already aware through discreet warnings, convened swiftly. Many of its members had served under Claudius and knew Agrippina's influence. Though some privately favored Britannicus, the young natural son of Claudius, few doubted the direction of events. They debated briefly, citing the emperor's own adoption of Nero and the need for stability, and agreed to ratify the succession. While the Senate deliberated, Agrippina ensured that Britannicus and his tutors remained within the inner apartments, away from the anxious eyes of the city. She instructed attendants to provide every courtesy but to limit his movement. It was presented as concern for the boy's safety, and in a sense it was, for the uncertain hours after an emperor's death could invite dangerous speculation. In the courtyard before the Praetorian barracks, the guard assembled in full formation. Nero, accompanied by Burrus and Seneca, stepped onto the raised platform. The soldiers watched in silence, their shields glinting under the morning sun. The young heir began to speak, his voice steady despite its youthful timbre. He praised the memory of Claudius, promised continuity of law and discipline, and expressed gratitude for the guard's steadfast loyalty to the empire. The address, rehearsed carefully with Seneca, was brief and dignified. When he concluded, Burrus raised his arm, and the soldiers responded with a unified salute and the deep, resonant acclamation reserved for an emperor. The sound carried across the courtyard like a slow-rolling wave. From there, the party moved to the Senate House. The senators, already prepared to declare their assent, welcomed Nero with the formal titles of power: Imperator, Augustus, and Pater Patri, Father of the Fatherland. Nero accepted with a measured bow, speaking of duty, harmony, and the guidance of experienced advisors. He emphasized his youth not as a weakness but as an opportunity to learn from Rome's most seasoned minds. The senators, many of whom had endured the unpredictability of previous reigns, responded with cautious approval. Throughout these proceedings, Agrippina remained a quiet but unmistakable presence. She stood slightly behind her son, her posture straight, her expression composed. When addressed, she answered with calm courtesy, but she offered no direct interference. Her influence was visible not in overt gestures but in the efficiency of the day's events. Messages dispatched on time, ceremonies executed without confusion, and each official reminded of his place in the carefully maintained order. As the Senate's formal recognition concluded, news spread quickly through the city. Merchants in the forum paused their bargaining to hear the criers announce the succession. Artisans laid down their tools for a moment as neighbors exchanged remarks about the young emperor. Some spoke of his cultured upbringing, others of his lineage through both Claudius and the revered Germanicus. There was curiosity, certainly, but little sign of unrest. Rome had experienced many changes of rule. The machinery of daily life continued. By midday, preparations began for the funeral of Claudius. The emperor would receive the full honors of apotheosis, a ceremony that would eventually declare him a god in the Roman pantheon. Architects and laborers were summoned to erect the funeral pyre, while priests consulted the rites that tradition demanded. Agrippina oversaw these arrangements with the same attention she had given to every aspect of palace management. Her instructions covered details as small as the placement of incense burners and as large as the sequence of the public procession. Nero spent the afternoon receiving delegations from the city's guilds and leading families. He listened politely to their pledges of loyalty, offering short responses that acknowledged their service and promised stability. Seneca remained at his side, occasionally adding a carefully chosen phrase to reinforce the sense of continuity. Burrus, meanwhile, met with commanders to ensure that the city's security remained unshaken. In the quieter moments between audiences, Agrippina joined her son to review the practical matters of governance. the confirmation of provincial governors, the maintenance of grain supplies, the scheduling of the funeral rites. Her voice remained calm, her questions precise. Nero, attentive and respectful, answered with the discipline she had instilled over years of preparation. Evening approached with a sky washed in muted gold. The day's ceremonies drew to a close, and the city settled into a mood of cautious acceptance. Lamps were lit along the main avenues, their glow reflecting on the surface of the Tiber. From the Palatine, Agrippina could see the city stretching outward in a quiet sprawl of rooftops and gardens, the same city that had greeted her as a child and that she now helped guide through another transition. In the privacy of the imperial quarters, mother and son shared a simple meal of bread, fruit, and watered wine. Nero spoke softly of the day's events, of the gravity he felt, of the countless eyes now fixed upon him. Agrippina listened without interruption. When he finished, she offered a few words of counsel. Patience in decision, clarity in command, and above all, the understanding that Rome valued steady governance over sudden display. Outside, the night deepened. The hum of the city softened to the low sounds of distant conversation and the slow rhythm of the Tiber's current. Within the palace, guards changed shifts with quiet precision. Scrolls of petitions and reports waited on polished tables for the new emperor's review at dawn. The first day of Nero's reign ended not with celebration but with an almost deliberate calm. There were no riots in the streets, no sudden challenges from ambitious rivals, only the steady continuation of Rome's daily life. The careful preparations of years, the patient cultivation of alliances, the strict discipline of appearances, the silent work of influence, had done their task. Yet even in the quiet of that evening, questions lingered in the air. Would the young emperor maintain the balance of restraint and authority that the day had demanded? Would the Senate's acceptance remain firm as months passed and decisions grew more complex? And as Nero began to exercise power in his own right, how long would he welcome the guidance of the mother who had secured the throne for him? Agrippina looked out across the moonlit city, aware that the path ahead would test every lesson she had learned. The first day had passed in calm order, but the long future of her son's rule, and of her own influence, was only beginning. The days that followed Nero's quiet accession unfolded with the slow precision of Roman ritual. The city, still murmuring about the youth of its new ruler, turned its attention to the final honors for the emperor who had reigned for nearly 14 years. Claudius would not simply be buried. According to the custom reserved for the most revered rulers, he would be elevated among the gods. From the Palatine, Agrippina oversaw the arrangements with her usual unhurried discipline. Architects and laborers moved through the forum, marking the site for the great funeral pyre. Carpenters brought tall timbers from the Sabine hills, their resinous scent filling the late autumn air. Bronze workers hammered decorative fittings for the bier, while seamstresses stitched draperies of deep purple edged in gold. Every step followed precedent, yet each detail required her approval. She walked the grounds in the early mornings, her voice low but firm as she directed the placement of torches and the order of the processional route. Nero met regularly with the Senate and the priestly colleges to confirm the rites of consecratio, the ceremony of deification. Senators debated the precise language of the decree that would declare Claudius Divus Claudius, the divine Claudius. Their words were formal, but the outcome was certain. Deification served the state as much as the memory of the emperor, affirming the seamless passage of power and the favor of the gods upon Rome. On the morning of the funeral, a hush settled over the city. Shops remained closed. The usual calls of market vendors were absent. Citizens gathered along the Via Sacra, the sacred way that wound from the Palatine through the Forum. The Tiber glimmered beneath a pale sky as the first light touched the Capitoline hill. The procession began with a slow rhythm of drums. Praetorian guards led the way, their polished armor catching the thin sunlight. Behind them came senators in white togas bordered with morning black, followed by magistrates and priests carrying incense burners. The smell of myrrh and frankincense drifted ahead of the bier, mingling with the cool air. Claudius's body, prepared with oils and wrapped in imperial robes, lay upon a tall catafalque draped in purple and gold. Golden eagles, symbols of apotheosis, stood at each corner, their wings raised as if poised for flight. The platform moved slowly on heavy wheels, drawn by oxen garlanded with laurel. Musicians played a steady, solemn melody on flutes and horns, the sound echoing against the marble facades of the forum. Agrippina walked near the front of the imperial family's contingent, her steps measured, her eyes forward. Nero followed slightly behind, wearing a toga of pure white edged with purple, his expression calm and composed. Britannicus, still a boy, walked beside tutors and attendants, his head bowed. To the watching crowd, the order of the family conveyed the new reality of succession without a word being spoken. Citizens stood in respectful silence as the procession passed. Some recalled the early years of Claudius's reign, when many had doubted the frail scholar's ability to rule. Others remembered the expansion of the empire into Britannia, the improvements to Rome's water supply, and the careful administration of law that had marked his tenure. There were no wild cheers, only the low murmur of shared memory. At the Field of Mars, the funeral pyre awaited. It rose high above the assembled crowd, a great wooden structure hung with purple cloth and decorated with statues of the gods. Priests performed the opening sacrifices. White oxen garlanded in flowers, their smoke rising into the still air. Prayers were chanted in measured cadences, calling upon Jupiter, Juno, and the ancestral spirits of Rome to receive Claudius among the divine. The body was placed within the pyre. As tradition required, an eagle, symbol of the soul's ascent, was set free, its wings beating upward into the sky. Torches touched the base of the structure, and flames began to climb the timbers, slow at first and then with growing force. The crackle of burning cedar filled the field, mingling with the chants of the priests. Agrippina stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the rising smoke. Nero, beside her, raised his hand in a formal salute. The crowd watched as the flames consumed the pyre, their light reflected in thousands of quiet eyes. No speech was necessary. The fire itself spoke of transition, from mortal ruler to divine protector. When the flames reached their height, a sudden updraft carried the eagle higher, a dark shape against the pale afternoon sky. The people murmured softly, taking the bird's flight as a sign that Claudius's spirit had indeed joined the company of the gods. The Senate's decree of deification, read aloud by a herald, confirmed what the ritual enacted. As evening settled over the city, the crowd dispersed in orderly silence. The ashes of Claudius would later be collected and placed in the mausoleum of Augustus, joining the line of Rome's deified emperors. The Field of Mars returned to quiet, its trampled grass carrying the faint scent of cedar smoke long after the fire had died. For Agrippina, the completion of the rites marked more than the honoring of a husband. It signaled the full legitimacy of her son's rule. A deified predecessor strengthened the authority of the living emperor, and she had ensured that every detail of the ceremony affirmed that link. That evening, back within the palace, Nero received senators and priests who offered final expressions of loyalty. He responded with carefully chosen words of gratitude, promising to govern in a manner worthy of his divine father. Seneca and Burrus stood nearby, their presence a quiet reminder that guidance remained close at hand. Agrippina moved among the guests with composed dignity. She spoke briefly with senior senators, thanked the priests for their service, and acknowledged the quiet commendations of the Praetorian commanders. Her manner suggested neither triumph nor grief, only the calm assurance of order maintained. Outside the palace, Rome resumed its evening rhythm. Lamplighters moved through the streets, their flames flickering against stone walls. The Tiber flowed on, reflecting the first stars of night. Citizens returned to their homes, carrying with them the memory of a day steeped in ritual and the sense that the gods themselves had approved the transfer of power. In the quiet of her private garden, Agrippina paused beneath a laurel tree. The air still held a faint trace of smoke from the distant pyre. She looked toward the city, its rooftops soft in the moonlight, and reflected on the long path that had brought her here. The careful alliances, the years of patience, the discipline of every word and gesture. The emperor was now a god, and her son sat firmly upon the throne. Yet even as she stood in the stillness, new questions gathered like distant clouds. How would Nero wield the authority that had come to him so swiftly? Would the Senate remain cooperative once the immediate solemnity of the funeral faded? And how long could a mother guide an emperor before the natural tides of power began to pull him toward independence? The night offered no answers. Only the steady rustle of leaves and the faraway murmur of the city accompanied her thoughts as Rome settled into a new era. One emperor consigned to the realm of the gods, another poised at the uncertain beginning of his reign. The weeks after Claudius's deification brought a curious lightness to Rome. The solemn smoke of the funeral pyre faded into memory, and the city settled into the rhythm of an emperor both new and unexpectedly approachable. Nero, only 17, presented himself not as a conqueror but as a youthful steward of the empire, eager to soothe the concerns of senators, soldiers, and common citizens alike. Senators gathered in the Curia Julia for the first formal meetings of Nero's reign. They found a ruler attentive and courteous. In his opening address, he spoke of the Senate as the ancient heart of Rome, promising to respect its traditions and to share governance rather than impose his will. He proposed a reduction of certain taxes that weighed heavily on provincial farmers and promised a review of legal disputes that had languished under earlier administrations. The words were crafted with the guidance of Seneca, whose elegant Latin shaped the speech into a gentle reassurance. Burrus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, ensured that the security surrounding the meetings was firm but discreet, allowing senators to feel the dignity of their role. The combination of intellectual polish and quiet military discipline gave the new regime an air of stability. Citizens in the forum reacted warmly to reports of these early decrees. Merchants welcomed the prospect of lighter tariffs on goods brought from distant provinces. Small farmers in Latium and Campania looked forward to fairer treatment from tax collectors. Even distant governors, hearing of the emperor's careful respect for senatorial authority, sent messages of cautious optimism. Nero understood, or was carefully taught, the value of presence. He appeared frequently in public, walking the porticos of the Forum with only a modest escort, greeting citizens in a voice that carried across the stone-paved square. He attended theatrical performances and occasionally read poetry of his own composition, a practice that delighted some and puzzled others. Musicians spoke of his genuine interest in melody and rhythm. He listened to their advice with the curiosity of a student rather than the command of a ruler. In the Circus Maximus, he watched the chariot races with a calm enthusiasm, applauding the victors without ostentation. Crowds noted the absence of the rigid formality that had marked Claudius's later years. Where the old emperor had seemed distant, this young Caesar smiled easily, his gestures open and familiar. For many Romans weary of bureaucratic caution, the change felt refreshing. Behind these early successes stood Agrippina, her presence quiet but unmistakable. She sat beside her son during official receptions, her chair slightly behind yet positioned so that all could see the shared authority. Petitioners often addressed her directly, confident that her word carried the weight of imperial decision. In private, she maintained the same discipline that had brought her to power. She met daily with Seneca and Burrus, reviewing decrees before they reached the Senate, discussing the loyalty of provincial governors, and ensuring the Praetorian Guard remained properly provisioned. Her correspondence extended across the empire, a network of letters that kept her informed of distant developments from Britannia to Syria. Nero accepted her counsel without visible resistance. He was still young enough to value the experience of his mother and the intellectual guidance of his tutor. Banquets at the Palatine often ended with quiet discussions among the three: mother, philosopher, and soldier, each contributing to the balance of governance. While the imperial household adjusted to new patterns, the city continued its ordinary life. Markets thrived as grain shipments from Egypt arrived without delay. Artisans hammered bronze and shaped marble in workshops along narrow lanes. Children played in the shadow of aqueducts that carried water from distant hills, their laughter echoing through stone archways. Public baths remained crowded in the afternoons. Citizens exchanged news of the emperor's appearances while soaking in the warm pools, their voices carrying the cautious optimism of a populace reassured by continuity. The Tiber, steady and brown in its autumn flow, reflected the slow-moving barges laden with oil, wine, and grain. To mark the new reign, the mint produced coins bearing Nero's youthful profile. The artistry captured a smooth, almost idealized face framed by a laurel wreath. On the reverse side appeared images of peace and prosperity: cornucopias, the goddess Roma, and the eternal flame of Vesta. Merchants and travelers carried these coins across the empire, spreading the likeness of the young emperor to distant provinces. Temples offered prayers for stability. The Vestal virgins tended the sacred fire with renewed ceremony, their white robes catching the sunlight as they processed through the forum. In the great temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, priests offered sacrifices for the health of the emperor and the continued favor of the gods. Yet beneath the public harmony, subtle tensions stirred. Some senators, while outwardly pleased by Nero's deference, whispered among themselves about the visible influence of Agrippina. A woman seated so near the seat of power unsettled traditions older than the city itself. They wondered how long the young emperor would tolerate such guidance, or how long the Senate would accept it. Within the Praetorian barracks, rumors circulated as well. Burrus maintained strict discipline, but soldiers speculated on the future. Would this gentle young man prove strong in crisis, or would the empire drift if challenged by rebellion or external threat? For now, the pay was steady and the rations plentiful, and speculation remained only that. Nero himself showed flashes of independent taste. He spent long hours with musicians and poets, discussing rhythms of Greek verse and the complex tuning of the cithara. Seneca encouraged his intellectual curiosity, hoping it would foster a love of reason and moderation. Agrippina, however, occasionally frowned at the time devoted to art rather than administration. It was an early sign, subtle but noticeable, that mother and son might one day diverge in their priorities. For the people of Rome, these were days of rare tranquility. The frontiers of the empire remained quiet. Trade routes stretched unbroken from the sands of Egypt to the forests of Gaul. The harvest had been good, and grain prices stayed stable. At night the city hummed with the ordinary sounds of taverns, theaters, and private courtyards where families shared evening meals beneath oil lamps. Visitors from distant provinces spoke of the capital's vastness, the sweep of the Circus Maximus, the towering arches of aqueducts, the orderly chaos of the forum where merchants and magistrates mingled. They carried home stories of a young emperor who smiled at children and spoke with poets, an image that traveled faster than any decree. Still, those closest to power sensed that this calm would not last forever. How long could a youth of 17 remain content with the role of dutiful pupil? Would the Senate's older statesmen continue to welcome the guiding hand of a mother seated so near the throne? And what would happen when Nero's own tastes, artistic, impulsive, perhaps unpredictable, began to press against the careful discipline of his advisors? For now, Rome breathed in the cool air of a peaceful autumn, the lamps of the Palatine glowing softly against the night. Agrippina, in her private chamber, reviewed reports from the provinces, her mind already measuring the unseen currents that might one day threaten the stability she had built. Nero, elsewhere in the palace, listened to the quiet notes of a lyre, the music carrying through marble halls like a promise of possibilities yet to be defined. The empire rested, poised between the steady order of tradition and the subtle stirrings of a new and untested era. The months that followed Nero's first decrees carried the quiet surface of order, yet below it subtle strains began to form. The empire's roads remained open, the grain fleets from Egypt arrived on time, and the frontiers were free of major conflict. But within the polished marble of the Palatine and the echoing chambers of the Senate, the old Roman habit of intrigue stirred like an undercurrent beneath still water. Senators had at first welcomed Nero's respectful tone. He addressed them as partners in governance, speaking of the shared duty to preserve the state. Yet as winter wore on, the more traditional among them grew uneasy. They noted the quiet presence of Agrippina at public ceremonies, her chair positioned close to her son's, her veil of black silk lending a gravity that few men dared to challenge. Some senators wondered privately whether the empire was ruled by the young prince or by the mother who had placed him on the throne. Petitions began to reach the Senate that asked, in careful language, for clearer boundaries between imperial family and state. No one named Agrippina directly, but their meaning was plain. These messages rarely reached the wider public, yet they passed between senior senators in the quiet corners of the Curia Julia, accompanied by the low murmur of speculation. Meanwhile, Nero's own habits grew more distinct. He continued to meet with the Senate, but his eyes lit more brightly when he spoke of music, poetry, and the dramatic arts. He spent long evenings in the company of Greek musicians, studying the subtle tunings of the cithara and experimenting with new forms of verse. Seneca encouraged such pursuits in moderation, believing that a mind trained in art might also be trained in reason. But the philosopher sensed the beginnings of a stronger pull, a fascination that might one day outgrow the careful balance of duty. Nero's visits to the theaters became more frequent. He attended rehearsals, asked questions about stage design, and spoke with actors about the fine detail of gesture and tone. Crowds welcomed his appearances with enthusiasm, charmed by an emperor who seemed to share their pleasures. Yet older citizens, schooled in the austere virtues of the Republic, muttered that such diversions were not fitting for the ruler of the world's greatest empire. Agrippina observed these changes with the quiet precision that had long defined her. She remained a visible presence at official gatherings, her voice calm and deliberate in council. In private, she continued her routine of correspondence, keeping informed of distant governors and the loyalty of provincial legions. Her mornings often began with the review of reports brought by trusted freedmen, updates on grain prices, troop movements, and the subtle signs of shifting alliances. She noticed with growing concern her son's long absences in the music halls and his preference for private dinners with young courtiers and performers. To her, these were not merely diversions but potential points of influence outside her careful supervision. More than once she advised him, gently but firmly, that an emperor's first duty was to Rome, not to the art of the stage. Nero listened politely and promised moderation, yet his eyes betrayed the quiet excitement of a young man discovering pleasures that required no maternal approval. Seneca and Burrus remained essential to the balance. The philosopher offered counsel in letters and quiet conversation, urging temperance and the steady application of reason. The prefect of the guard maintained strict order among the praetorians, ensuring that the army's loyalty was secure. Together they formed a barrier between the youthful impulses of the emperor and the potential unrest of the political class. Still, they recognized the limits of their influence. Burrus, seasoned by years of military service, understood that discipline could maintain loyalty but not passion. Seneca, for all his eloquence, knew that philosophy offered guidance but could not wholly redirect a will increasingly drawn to art and personal indulgence. Whispers began to travel through Rome's shaded porticos and crowded bathhouses. Some claimed that Agrippina had begun to lose her son's ear, that musicians and actors now enjoyed the private audiences once reserved for state advisors. Others suggested that the Senate, quietly encouraged by Burrus, might welcome a soft separation between the emperor and his mother. Merchants and common citizens repeated these stories in the markets, mixing them with the ordinary chatter of trade and weather. The rumors held no immediate threat, but they hinted at a city alert to the faintest signs of change. Rome had seen enough of emperors and their families to know that small shifts often preceded greater storms. Through it all, daily life continued. Cold winds swept across the Tiber, carrying the scent of damp stone and wood smoke. Citizens wrapped themselves in heavy cloaks as they queued at public fountains or bargained for fresh vegetables brought from the surrounding countryside. Children skated across thin layers of ice that formed overnight on shallow pools, their laughter ringing beneath the gray sky. Artisans worked by lamplight in narrow workshops, shaping marble and hammering bronze. The theaters remained lively, their stages bright with torchlight even as the evenings grew long. Travelers from distant provinces spoke of the emperor's youthful energy and his surprising informality, stories that spread across the empire with each returning caravan. One evening, Agrippina invited a small group of senators to a private dinner in the Palatine Gardens. The meal was simple: roasted fish, olives, warm bread. Yet the setting carried the weight of imperial authority. She spoke of the need for unity and the continued prosperity of the provinces. Her words were measured, her tone calm, but the message was clear. The empire remained under steady guidance. As the senators departed, they exchanged cautious glances. They respected her composure, yet some wondered whether the young emperor would always accept such oversight. The question lingered as they descended the hill and returned to their own homes, the flicker of torches marking their slow progress through the night. By early spring, the first blossoms of almond trees appeared along the roads leading into the city. Merchants spoke of a good planting season. Ships laden with grain prepared to leave Alexandria, their sails catching the fresh sea winds. Rome seemed secure, yet those close to power sensed that the calm was a surface tension, ready to break with the slightest disturbance. Would Nero's love of art draw him further from the duties of rule? Would the Senate grow bolder in questioning Agrippina's influence? And how long could the careful alliance of philosopher, soldier, mother, and son hold against the natural currents of ambition and youth? For the moment, Rome slept beneath a quiet sky, the lamps of the Palatine glowing faintly above the dark river. But in the silence of those early nights, the empire stood poised at the edge of change, each figure, mother, son, advisor, and senate, moving in slow, deliberate steps toward an unwritten future. The spring that followed was bright and warm. The almond blossoms that had opened along the roads outside Rome gave way to soft green leaves, and the scent of new growth drifted across the Tiber. The city enjoyed a season of prosperity, yet inside the imperial household the slow shift of power was beginning to show itself with quiet clarity. Nero's days grew longer and less predictable. Where once he began each morning in formal audience, listening to petitions and reviewing reports with his mother and advisors, he now lingered over music rehearsals or private walks through the gardens. When he did meet with the Senate, he arrived later, sometimes allowing Seneca or Burrus to handle preliminary matters without him. Agrippina noticed these changes with the precision of someone long accustomed to watching details. She continued to receive provincial letters at dawn and to speak with freedmen about grain shipments and troop movements, but she found that her son increasingly preferred to hear such reports secondhand. When she offered reminders, he smiled politely, promising attention at a later hour that seldom came. At public ceremonies, the subtle distance was more visible. During processions, the young emperor walked a pace ahead, his gestures more assured. Agrippina still occupied a seat near the throne, but now her chair was placed slightly farther back, as if the court decorators had quietly adjusted the arrangement without formal instruction. No announcement accompanied these changes, yet those who observed court protocol understood the meaning. Nero's fascination with the arts deepened. He spent long evenings with Greek poets, discussing the delicate measures of lyric verse. He invited musicians from Asia Minor to teach him complex modes of tuning the cithara. In the quiet hours after sunset, the sounds of their rehearsals drifted through the marble corridors of the Palatine, a gentle music that mixed with the scent of oil lamps. He also began to explore architectural projects. Accompanied by engineers, he walked the slopes of the Esquiline Hill, speaking of gardens, fountains, and open-air theaters that would one day bring beauty to the city. He sketched ideas on wax tablets, his youthful imagination racing ahead of the cautious pace of his builders. Seneca encouraged these interests when they served the public good. Gardens and theaters could benefit the people, he reasoned, but he also urged moderation. An emperor might love art, but he must not become its servant. Nero listened with outward respect, yet his mind often wandered toward melodies and designs rather than the measured words of philosophy. Agrippina, ever disciplined, sought to maintain her influence without open conflict. She requested private audiences, reminding her son of the importance of military readiness, the loyalty of distant provinces, and the necessity of careful diplomacy with the Senate. Nero responded with courteous phrases but offered fewer details of his own plans. At a small banquet one evening, she spoke of a proposed alliance with the Parthian king, emphasizing the strategic need to secure Rome's eastern frontier. Nero nodded but quickly turned the conversation to a new performance planned for the theater of Pompey. The shift was gentle yet unmistakable. Rumors of their changing relationship spread through the palace. Freedmen and servants, moving between the private apartments and the great reception halls, carried whispered observations to the markets and bathhouses of the city. Citizens began to speak of a young emperor eager to rule in his own way, and a mother whose long reach might soon meet resistance. Burrus watched these developments with a soldier's eye. He ensured that the Praetorian Guard remained loyal to the person of the emperor rather than to any single advisor or family member. The prefect reported regularly to both Nero and Agrippina, but he understood that the balance of power was shifting. Seneca continued to offer measured guidance. He praised Nero's interest in public works, framing them as a gift to the people and a way to secure lasting reputation. At the same time, he quietly counseled restraint, reminding the emperor that popularity could fade if extravagance outpaced the treasury. Seneca's letters from this period speak of a careful hope, that the young ruler might blend art with duty, creativity with moderation. Meanwhile, Rome itself remained lively and largely content. Spring markets bustled with grain, olives, and new wines from the southern slopes of Italy. Children chased each other along the stone-paved alleys, their laughter rising above the clatter of carts. Public baths filled each afternoon with citizens exchanging gossip about the emperor's concerts and the quiet rumors of tension in the palace. Visitors from the provinces brought stories of the emperor's kindness to petitioners and his youthful charm at public games. Many found it difficult to believe that subtle conflicts existed behind the polished marble of the Palatine. To the wider empire, Rome appeared stable and prosperous. One evening, Nero invited select senators to a private rehearsal in the theater of Pompey. He did not perform, but he sat among them as musicians played and actors recited new tragedies from Greece. After the performance, he spoke with unusual energy about the beauty of the verses, the skill of the actors, and his vision of Rome as a city where art and governance might share equal honor. Some senators applauded politely, others exchanged cautious glances. They recognized the emperor's genuine passion, but they also sensed that his enthusiasm might someday overshadow the practical concerns of state. Still, no one dared to discourage him directly. The memory of earlier emperors had taught them the value of cautious agreement. Soon after, Nero hosted a small dinner for a circle of friends and advisors, Seneca, Burrus, and a few young poets, without inviting Agrippina. The gathering was informal, marked by laughter and music rather than policy. It was the first such event held entirely outside his mother's presence. Those who attended understood its significance. The emperor was signaling, gently but unmistakably, that he could choose his company without her oversight. When Agrippina learned of the dinner, she made no public complaint. She greeted her son the next morning with her usual composure, speaking of provincial grain shipments and the loyalty of the legions in Germania. But her eyes, those who watched closely said, held a quiet calculation. By midsummer, the city glowed with heat, and the Tiber moved slowly beneath the relentless sun. Merchants erected awnings to shade their stalls. Citizens retreated to the cool interiors of bathhouses. In the imperial gardens, roses bloomed and faded in the heavy air. Within the palace, the pattern was set. A young emperor expanding his interests and authority, a mother maintaining influence with steady discipline, and advisors walking the careful line between guidance and independence. The empire itself remained at peace, but those close to power sensed the slow turning of the wheel. How long could this delicate arrangement hold? Would Nero's growing confidence lead to decisions that tested the Senate's patience or his mother's restraint? Could the bonds of family and council endure as ambition and curiosity pulled the emperor toward his own vision of rule? These questions lingered in the warm Roman night as the lamps of the Palatine flickered against the dark sky, their light a quiet reminder that even in seasons of calm, change moves steadily forward. The year turned, and with it came small changes that only the patient eye could measure. The mornings grew cooler, carrying the dry scent of leaves along the Tiber. Merchants returning from summer fairs spoke of good harvests, of quiet roads, and of an emperor increasingly seen without the guiding presence of his mother. Agrippina remained within the palace walls, her routine as disciplined as ever. She rose before dawn to read reports from the provinces and to speak with her trusted freedmen. Yet the rhythm of her days was altered. Audiences with her son, once expected and regular, were now arranged only when Nero chose to grant them. Sometimes he would postpone a meeting for an evening concert or a stroll in the gardens. Other times he would send a polite note, warmly worded but firm, explaining that his schedule was full. The visual cues of authority also began to shift. At formal ceremonies, Agrippina still wore the deep green cloak that marked her as Augusta, but her seat was now consistently placed a step below the emperor's. At first this change was explained as a mere adjustment of protocol. But those who observed court life understood that such arrangements seldom occurred without purpose. Nero's household filled with new voices. Poets from Alexandria brought fragments of fresh verse. Musicians from Greece introduced subtle melodies that echoed through the halls at night. A handful of young aristocrats, eager for favor, offered lively conversation and tales of travel beyond the Aegean. They became regular companions for late suppers and moonlit discussions. These gatherings were not openly political, yet they drew the emperor's attention away from the more measured counsel of Seneca, Burrus, and his mother. When matters of administration did arise, grain supply, provincial taxation, the management of distant legions, Nero addressed them with a brisk practicality, as if eager to return to music and talk of theater. Seneca continued to offer guidance in the measured tones of philosophy. He spoke of the virtues of moderation, of the delicate balance between pleasure and responsibility. Nero listened, often with genuine affection, but his decisions increasingly reflected his own taste rather than his tutor's careful arguments. Burrus remained the silent pillar of the Praetorian Guard. He ensured discipline among the troops and loyalty to the emperor. He also served as a quiet observer of the growing gap between mother and son. Though he respected Agrippina's years of service, he recognized that the guard's allegiance must follow the living ruler. The people of Rome noticed these developments in their own way. In the crowded forums and busy bathhouses, gossip moved as swiftly as the warm autumn winds. Citizens whispered that the young emperor now ruled in truth as well as in name. Some wondered if Agrippina, once the visible force behind the throne, would soon retire to a private estate. Others speculated that she still held secret influence, guiding events from behind closed doors. Markets remained full. Bakers sold fresh bread before dawn, their ovens glowing like small suns. Fishermen along the Tiber hauled in their catches beneath the misty morning light. For ordinary Romans, the empire's prosperity mattered more than the subtleties of palace politics. Still, the gradual withdrawal of Agrippina became a topic of quiet conversation. When Agrippina did appear beside her son, the difference was striking. At a dedication ceremony for a new public fountain, Nero greeted the crowd with easy confidence. He spoke of the city's beauty and the importance of providing clean water to every district. Agrippina stood slightly behind, her expression serene, her hands folded. The crowd cheered for the emperor's words, the sound rising like a warm tide. Though they still acknowledged her presence with respect, the energy of devotion now flowed almost entirely toward the young ruler. After the ceremony, mother and son shared a quiet meal in a shaded courtyard. The conversation, according to a servant who poured their wine, remained polite but restrained. They spoke of the day's dedication, of the health of the provinces, and of upcoming games. But the closeness that had once marked their exchanges seemed to have thinned like mist beneath the midday sun. Seeking respite from the constant movement of the city, Agrippina spent increasing time at her coastal villa in Antium. There, she walked along the rocky shore in the cool mornings and oversaw the maintenance of the gardens. She continued to receive letters from senators and provincial governors, but these visits were now social rather than political. Friends who traveled to see her described evenings of quiet conversation, the sound of waves mingling with the soft music of lyres. She remained a figure of dignity and quiet authority, but those close to her recognized a subtle change. The careful energy that had once driven her every action now seemed tempered by reflection. Perhaps she understood that her son's independence was inevitable. Perhaps she was planning her next move with the patience of experience. In Rome, Nero advanced ambitious plans for architecture and entertainment. He discussed expanding the circus for grander races and commissioning new gardens that would stretch across the Esquiline Hill. He began to dream of a residence that would reflect his vision of imperial grandeur, an idea that would, in time, become the famous Domus Aurea. These projects captured his imagination more than the slow negotiations of provincial politics. Senators debated the costs in cautious tones. Some admired the emperor's creativity, while others worried about the strain on the treasury. For the moment, Nero's charm and the empire's healthy revenues kept open opposition at bay. Agrippina did not openly challenge these plans. She wrote letters of congratulations for each new project and sent small gifts to the architects. But she also reminded her son, in gentle conversation, of the responsibilities of rule, the defense of borders, the maintenance of order, the welfare of the people. Her words carried the weight of experience, but they no longer shaped the course of events as they once had. It was a transition marked by silence rather than confrontation. The empire continued to thrive. The Senate met regularly, the legions remained loyal, and trade flowed across the Mediterranean. Yet within the palace, those who watched closely felt the quiet conclusion of an era. As autumn deepened, the sky over Rome took on a sharper blue. Leaves turned gold and drifted across the stone courtyards of the Palatine. Agrippina, walking beneath the tall cypress trees, might have considered the path she had traveled, from the ambitious daughter of Germanicus to the decisive mother of an emperor. Did she see her life's work fulfilled in her son's independence? Or did she sense the approaching uncertainty that independence might bring? No records capture her private thoughts. What remains are the impressions of observers, servants, senators, distant chroniclers, who sensed that the balance of Roman power had quietly shifted. The empire stood calm beneath a clear sky, but history has shown that calm skies often hide the first movements of a coming storm. The winter rains returned to Rome with a gentle persistence. Streets glistened beneath gray skies, and the Tiber swelled with the steady runoff from distant hills. Merchants set canvas awnings above their stalls, and citizens moved briskly through the damp air, cloaks drawn tight. The empire still prospered, yet within the marble halls of the Palatine, the atmosphere had grown subtly taut. Nero was now a young man of 20, his manner more assured than the shy youth who had once deferred to his mother's counsel. He presided over Senate meetings with a steady voice, choosing his words carefully and charming even those who had doubted his abilities. When petitions arrived from provincial governors, he answered swiftly, often without seeking advice from Seneca or Burrus. His decisions were not always perfect, but they displayed a growing confidence that impressed his supporters. The people of Rome responded warmly. At public games and festivals, cheers greeted him with a fervor that recalled the early days of Augustus. Citizens admired his generosity, occasional distributions of grain, the sponsorship of games, the promise of new entertainment venues. In the marketplaces, his name was spoken with casual approval, a sign that his popularity remained strong. Agrippina observed these developments with a careful eye. Her presence at official functions had diminished, though she still carried the title of Augusta. She continued to receive visitors in her private apartments and at her villa in Antium, but her influence over policy had clearly waned. Letters she sent to her son, offering guidance on military appointments or financial matters, were acknowledged politely but often set aside. Friends who dined with her in those months described her as composed yet thoughtful, her conversation more reflective than in earlier years. She spoke of family histories, of the deeds of her father Germanicus and her mother Agrippina the Elder. At times she recalled her childhood memories of the Rhine frontier, where legions marched through mist and pine. Her words hinted at pride, but also at an awareness that her own moment of direct power was passing. Within Nero's inner circle, new companions gained prominence. A small group of young courtiers, musicians, poets, and ambitious nobles, shared his evenings of music and debate. They were eager to please and quick to encourage his artistic ambitions. Their presence, light-hearted and flattering, contrasted with the measured tone of Seneca and the quiet discipline of Burrus. Seneca noticed the change and offered discreet caution. In private letters and conversations, he reminded the emperor that praise without substance can lead even wise rulers astray. Burrus, ever the soldier, focused on maintaining the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, ensuring that the core of imperial security remained stable. Yet the emperor listened selectively. He valued his advisors, but he increasingly valued his own instincts more. Gossip thrives in corridors where marble walls echo with footsteps. Servants, freedmen, and minor officials began to trade small stories. Of a young emperor who preferred the company of entertainers to senators, of an Augusta who still commanded loyalty among certain noble families, of subtle glances exchanged during ceremonies when mother and son crossed paths. Most of these tales were harmless, yet they added a faint edge to the atmosphere of the court. Even in prosperous times, Romans were attuned to the slightest hints of discord within the imperial household. Late in the season, Nero hosted a grand banquet to celebrate the dedication of a new public theater. Marble columns were draped with silk, and musicians played soft melodies as guests reclined on couches of carved wood. Senators, poets, and foreign envoys filled the room with conversation. The emperor moved easily among them, his laughter carrying above the music. Agrippina arrived late, her green cloak shimmering in the lamplight. She greeted her son with formal warmth and took her place slightly apart from his closest companions. Observers noted the dignity of her posture, the deliberate calm of her words. She spoke of the theater's beauty and the honor it would bring to Rome, but her eyes held a quiet reserve. The evening passed without incident, yet many guests left with the sense that they had witnessed a performance more complex than the music and recitations, a subtle display of distance between mother and son. Outside the banquet halls, the Praetorian Guard kept careful watch. Burrus ensured that patrols were frequent and discreet. The guard's loyalty to Nero was firm, yet Burrus understood that stability depended on constant attention. He maintained communication with key centurions and kept a quiet record of any unusual movements within the city. His diligence was not the product of immediate crisis, but of experience. He knew that Rome's peace often rested on unseen preparations. Beyond the palace, Rome continued its daily rhythm. The forum bustled each morning as merchants arranged stalls of olives, figs, and late-season grapes. Artisans hammered bronze and marble in narrow workshops, their tools ringing through the damp air. Children chased each other across slick cobblestones, their laughter rising like birdsong. Public baths filled with citizens eager for warmth. There, amid steam and conversation, rumors of imperial tensions mixed with talk of harvest yields and distant trade routes. Most Romans, while curious about palace affairs, cared more about the steady supply of bread and the promise of spring festivals. For all the outward stability, those closest to power sensed a subtle tightening of the weave. Nero's independence was now unquestioned, but his choices, artistic ambitions, lavish entertainments, the favor shown to certain companions, hinted at future challenges. Agrippina's dignity remained unshaken, yet her reduced role created a quiet vacuum where ambition might eventually flow. Seneca continued to hope for moderation. Burrus maintained vigilance. Agrippina watched, perhaps calculating possibilities that only she could fully grasp. The empire's foundations held firm, but history often records that tension builds slowly, beneath the surface, before the world above notices the first crack. As the winter rains softened into the early mists of spring, the lamps of the Palatine burned late into the night. Behind closed doors, decisions and conversations shaped the months to come. Decisions whose significance would only be recognized when the calm of Rome gave way to the next turning of fate. The first light of spring touched Rome with a pale gold glow. Morning mist lifted slowly from the Tiber, and the city stirred to life. Bakers setting their ovens, merchants arranging baskets of early vegetables, children racing across the stone-paved streets. The empire remained at peace, yet within the imperial household the quiet tension of the previous months pressed more firmly on every conversation. Agrippina had retreated for much of the winter to her villa at Antium, the seaside estate where the steady sound of waves seemed to soften the relentless pace of politics. Here she walked the rocky paths each dawn, her cloak wrapped tight against the sea wind. Letters arrived daily, reports from allies in the Senate, notes from old friends, and the routine communications of estate management. She read them all with a deliberate calm. Visitors found her reflective but not resigned. She spoke of family history, of the long chain of Caesars and the lessons of past rulers. Sometimes she mentioned her father Germanicus, whose popularity and tragic death still shaped the memory of Rome. Other times she recalled her mother's strength on distant frontiers. Her words carried the steady tone of someone reviewing a lifetime of choices, yet her questions hinted at unfinished purpose. In Rome, Nero's independence continued to grow. Senators came to him directly with petitions. Foreign envoys requested audiences without the customary visits to his mother. Agrippina's name still commanded respect, but her active role in state matters had all but ended. When she returned to the city for formal occasions, she was greeted with deference, yet the ceremonial distance was unmistakable. At games in the circus, she occupied a prominent seat but no longer shared the attention of the crowd. The cheers were for the emperor alone, his youthful energy now the center of public devotion. Seneca, observing the changes, continued to counsel moderation. He praised Nero's generous festivals and his support for the arts, but he also spoke privately of the need for balance, reminding the emperor that fortune is fickle and that popularity can fade. Burrus maintained the discipline of the Praetorian Guard, ensuring that the heart of imperial security remained steady. Both men understood that their influence rested on Nero's goodwill. They offered advice carefully, aware that a young ruler enjoying freedom might resist even the gentlest restraint. Agrippina, ever skilled in the art of patience, began to consider her position. She knew that open confrontation would only harden her son's resolve. Yet she also understood the precariousness of life at the center of Roman power. Allies could shift, whispers could spread, and a single accusation could alter fortunes overnight. She strengthened ties with long-standing friends among the nobility, exchanging letters and small gifts that reinforced bonds of loyalty. She welcomed visiting governors and their families to her villa, offering hospitality that was both gracious and quietly political. Her gestures were subtle, but they signaled that she remained a figure of consequence. Meanwhile, Nero surrounded himself with a livelier company of poets, actors, and ambitious courtiers. Their music and conversation filled the palace late into the night, echoing down marble corridors long after formal meetings had ended. They encouraged his artistic ambitions, plans for grand performances, new theaters, and elaborate celebrations of the arts. The emperor's delight in these gatherings did not escape his mother's notice. She recognized the power of influence that entertainment and admiration could wield. She also understood how quickly such companions might turn their attentions elsewhere if fortune shifted. In early spring, Agrippina returned briefly to Rome to request a private audience with her son. Accounts differ on the details, but several chroniclers describe a meeting marked by careful politeness. Mother and son spoke of the city's prosperity, of grain shipments from Egypt, of the loyalty of the legions in the east. Agrippina praised his public works and expressed hope that he would continue to strengthen Rome's defenses. Nero listened, responding with courteous words and measured smiles. But those who served nearby reported that the conversation carried an undertone of formality, a sense that the deep trust of earlier years had thinned. The Senate, long accustomed to reading the unspoken language of imperial households, observed these developments with quiet interest. They welcomed the emperor's growing independence but also valued the stabilizing presence Agrippina had once provided. Some senators sent respectful letters to her villa, maintaining ties with the mother of the ruler even as they focused their petitions on her son. For now, the city remained calm. Trade moved steadily through the ports of Ostia. Workshops hummed with the sound of artisans crafting metal and stone. Citizens enjoyed public baths and open-air markets, their conversations a blend of practical concerns and distant gossip of the imperial family. By mid-season, the air over Rome was clear and warm. The Palatine gardens bloomed with roses and laurel, and the nights carried the gentle fragrance of early summer. Yet within the imperial household, the quiet distance between mother and son had hardened into something less easily bridged. Agrippina surely sensed the shift. Whether walking along the Antium shore or sitting beneath the cypress trees of her villa's courtyard, she must have known that the lines of influence she had drawn so carefully were fading. The empire she had worked to shape was now firmly in her son's hands. Still, she remained watchful. Her life had been one of strategy and endurance, of surviving storms that had undone others. It was not in her nature to retreat entirely, nor to surrender the careful dignity she carried as daughter of Germanicus and mother of the emperor. As evening fell over Rome, the lamps of the Palatine flickered against the darkening sky. Somewhere in the city, musicians played soft notes on the cithara, their music mingling with the hum of distant voices. Did Agrippina consider a final effort to guide her son, or had she accepted the inevitable distance between them? Would Nero continue along a path of measured independence, or would ambition and youthful desire lead him toward choices that tested the empire's calm? History records only fragments. The letters of senators, the observations of chroniclers, the silence of the woman herself. What remains is the image of a mother who had shaped an empire and who now watched, poised between influence and obscurity, as her son's future unfolded beyond her reach. The Roman summer arrived with its familiar weight of heat and dust. Streets shimmered beneath the sun, and the Tiber ran slow and low, its brown water reflecting the pale blue of a cloudless sky. Merchants hung damp cloths across their shopfronts to catch the faintest breeze, while citizens sought shade beneath colonnades, and in the cool interiors of the public baths. The empire, outwardly strong, moved through its seasonal rhythm, but in the quiet spaces of the Palatine, a subtler rhythm, a pulse of unease began to sound. Rome was a city that thrived on whispers. Couriers from distant provinces carried more than official letters. They brought stories of shifting alliances, of unexpected deaths, of governors who prospered or faltered. Servants repeated overheard fragments as they shopped in the crowded markets, and soon even the simplest remark could travel from the palace to the Subura district within a single afternoon. That summer, the whispers centered on the relationship between the emperor and his mother. Citizens who once spoke of them as an inseparable pair now speculated about distance, even rivalry. Some claimed that Agrippina plotted to reclaim influence through sympathetic senators. Others insisted that Nero, eager for complete independence, sought counsel from advisors who urged him to sever ties with the woman who had once guided every decision. No single tale carried proof, yet the atmosphere of suggestion grew thick enough to be felt in the forums and bathhouses. Rome had learned long ago that where there is persistent rumor, some spark of truth often hides. Nero continued to devote himself to artistic pursuits. He arranged private performances of music and drama, inviting a select audience of poets, actors, and musicians. The emperor himself sometimes played the cithara, his skill improving with practice, his delight in performance unmistakable. He also advanced grand architectural plans. Engineers walked the slopes of the Esquiline Hill with him, discussing new gardens and the possibility of a vast residence that would blend art, water, and open space. A dream that hinted at what would one day become the Domus Aurea. Senators murmured cautious approval, though some feared the expense. For now, the treasury remained healthy, and the people welcomed the promise of beauty and employment such projects would bring. Agrippina watched from a growing distance. At her villa in Antium, she maintained a household of dignity and quiet order. Visitors found her calm, but they sensed the sharpened awareness of someone accustomed to the ebb and flow of power. She still received letters from friends in the Senate and from provincial officials who respected her lineage. These communications were social rather than strategic, yet the very act of correspondence carried a political undertone in a city where alliances could shift overnight. When she returned to Rome for formal occasions, she carried herself with the same measured grace. But her appearances were less frequent, her conversations with her son brief and ceremonial. Chroniclers later wrote of meetings filled with courteous words and careful silences. Seneca, whose influence had shaped the first years of Nero's reign, recognized the potential danger in the widening gap between mother and son. In private counsel, he urged patience and balance. He reminded the emperor that respect for family strengthened imperial legitimacy, even when personal disagreements arose. Burrus, responsible for the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, quietly reinforced the need for stability. Both men understood that a rupture in the imperial household could invite unrest, even in a time of prosperity. Yet their advice could only reach so far. Nero, now fully confident in his authority, listened politely but followed his own instincts. The young ruler enjoyed the admiration of the people and the Senate's deference. He felt secure enough to chart his own path. The signs of change were small but unmistakable. When Agrippina entered the imperial palace, her receptions were formal rather than familiar. The emperor greeted her with measured courtesy, offering the honors due to an Augusta but little of a son's warmth. Servants noticed that their private meals together had become rare. Letters from mother to son, once answered promptly, now sometimes waited days for a reply. Even the careful protocols of ceremonial seating shifted by degrees. Her chair moved another step back at public festivals, her name spoken less often in official announcements. Outside the palace walls, daily life continued. In the markets, traders displayed amphorae of oil and baskets of figs beneath makeshift awnings. Children splashed in shallow fountains, their laughter ringing above the hum of commerce. Citizens discussed grain prices and shipping schedules from Alexandria, but inevitably conversation returned to the imperial household. Some expressed concern that the emperor's devotion to the arts might distract him from governance. Others admired his youthful energy and spoke approvingly of the public entertainments he sponsored. All agreed that the distance between Nero and Agrippina was now plain to see. Among Rome's senatorial families, quiet calculations began. A few maintained contact with Agrippina out of respect for her lineage and past influence. Others focused their attentions entirely on Nero, offering gifts and support to the ruler whose authority now stood alone. These choices were not dramatic, but they revealed an understanding that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Burrus, vigilant as ever, kept careful watch on the guard. He issued subtle reminders that loyalty belonged to the emperor, not to any faction or family member. The Praetorian ranks remained steady, yet he knew from experience that unity required constant attention. Despite her reduced influence, Agrippina did not retreat into quiet obscurity. She managed her estates with precision, ensuring that her household remained prosperous and well-connected. She welcomed visitors from distant provinces, offering hospitality that underscored her enduring status as the daughter of Germanicus and the mother of a reigning emperor. Observers noted that she carried herself with the same calm authority that had guided her through years of political storms. Whether she still hoped to regain a measure of influence or simply sought to preserve her dignity, no one could say. As late summer faded toward autumn, the heat softened, and the sky deepened into a richer blue. Rome prepared for the harvest festivals, the streets alive with anticipation of games and feasts. Yet within the imperial family, the quiet tension remained. Did Nero wonder whether his mother's enduring connections posed a challenge to his independence? Did Agrippina consider new strategies to remain essential in a court that no longer sought her counsel? History offers no direct words from either, only the observations of those who watched and sensed the careful balance between restraint and suspicion. The lamps of the Palatine burned late into many nights, their glow flickering against the marble walls. Beyond those walls, the city slept beneath the warm Roman sky, unaware of how close the calm had come to its breaking point. Autumn deepened over Rome with a quiet inevitability. The days shortened, the evenings cooled, and the sky acquired a faint silver haze. Merchants stacked amphorae of the year's new wine along the river docks, while bakers prepared for the festivals of the harvest. In the imperial household, however, the season brought little comfort. The gradual distancing of mother and son, so long a matter of rumor, began to settle into a permanent state. Agrippina returned from her coastal villa to attend the ceremonies of the harvest. She arrived with the dignity of her rank. A small retinue of attendants, a litter carried by strong bearers, and an air of calm command. But the welcome she received was strikingly restrained. The emperor greeted her before a gathering of senators and officials, offering the expected courtesies and a formal kiss. There was no warmth in his voice. The seating arrangements at the celebratory banquet confirmed what the city already sensed. Agrippina, once placed near the emperor's side, now sat at a lower table among other imperial relatives. No announcement explained the change, yet every senator present understood the significance. Ceremony in Rome was never accidental. Servants, who observed such details more closely than their masters imagined, carried the news across the city before nightfall. By morning, merchants and laborers discussed it over bread and olives as though it were a public proclamation. The emperor had quietly redefined his mother's place. Nero's own circle shifted accordingly. Advisors and companions who valued artistic expression and personal pleasure became more prominent. Young men of patrician birth, musicians, actors, poets, visited the palace in increasing numbers. They entertained the emperor with performances and conversation that blended philosophy with amusement. Seneca and Burrus maintained their advisory roles, but they sensed their counsel carried less weight. The emperor listened with polite attention, then followed his own inclination. Both men, seasoned in the politics of survival, recognized the limits of their influence and chose caution over confrontation. For Agrippina, these developments confirmed what she had long suspected. Her son no longer required her guidance. The woman who had maneuvered through decades of imperial danger understood the precariousness of her position. A mother could not easily compete with the enthusiasms of youth and the attractions of unchallenged power. Agrippina began spending longer periods at her seaside estate near Antium. The villa overlooked a gentle curve of shoreline where waves rolled in with the slow rhythm of the Mediterranean. Here, away from the incessant noise of Rome, she maintained a court of her own, trusted freedmen, visiting senators, and a handful of old family allies. Her days followed a deliberate pattern. Morning walks through olive groves, long hours of reading letters from friends and provincial governors, and careful management of her properties. She never abandoned the habits of order and attention to detail that had sustained her through earlier storms. Travelers who dined at her table reported that she remained composed and sharp-minded. She discussed harvest yields, trade routes, and the subtle politics of the eastern provinces with the clarity of someone who had once directed the affairs of an empire. Yet, even in the tranquil surroundings of Antium, she could not ignore the slow erosion of her connection to the seat of power. News from Rome occasionally carried an edge of unease. Friends who visited the capital spoke of new favorites at court and the growing boldness of those who sensed Agrippina's influence waning. One or two hinted, never directly, that the emperor's companions sometimes mocked the cautionary advice of older statesmen and praised a future free of maternal oversight. Such words were carefully chosen, for they knew that repetition of rumor could endanger both speaker and listener. Still, the implication was clear. The distance between mother and son had become more than social. It was now political. Agrippina considered her options. To press for renewed influence would risk open conflict. To withdraw entirely might invite irrelevance, or worse, suspicion of secret plotting. She chose a middle path, dignified presence without direct interference, a strategy she hoped would keep her safe. Back in the city, the populace went about its routines. Markets bustled with grain shipments from Africa and fish from the Tyrrhenian coast. Children chased one another through narrow lanes while vendors shouted the price of late-season figs. Yet conversation often turned to the imperial family. Some citizens admired the emperor's youthful independence. Others expressed unease at the idea of an emperor unbound by the moderating influence of his mother and seasoned advisors. In Rome, memory of past rulers, both steady and erratic, remained vivid. People knew that the character of a single man could shape the fortunes of millions. Burrus, ever vigilant, maintained the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard. He rotated assignments, ensured fair pay, and kept careful watch for any sign of unrest. His quiet diligence helped maintain stability even as the imperial household shifted in mood and allegiance. He also kept a cautious eye on Agrippina's movements. While she posed no open threat, her lineage and reputation meant that any gathering in her villa could, in the eyes of a suspicious emperor, be interpreted as intrigue. Burrus reported facts without exaggeration, understanding that accuracy was the surest path to survival. Nero, for his part, seemed determined to define himself apart from his mother's shadow. He expanded his patronage of the arts, commissioning new performances and contemplating ambitious building projects. He spoke more frequently of travel to Greece, where music and theater held a revered place. Those close to him observed that he rarely mentioned Agrippina except in formal contexts. When he did, his tone was respectful but distant, as if speaking of a figure from the past rather than a living presence. The change was not marked by a single declaration but by countless small decisions, a gradual severing of ties that once seemed unbreakable. As the season turned, Rome prepared for the approach of winter. The nights grew longer, the air carried the scent of wood smoke, and the Tiber reflected the pale light of early moons. Families stored grain and oil, merchants tallied their accounts, and the city settled into its ancient rhythms. High on the Palatine Hill, lamps burned late as imperial servants moved quietly through marble corridors. Down the coast, Agrippina walked her terrace beneath a wide, star-filled sky, listening to the distant surf. Two lives, once bound by ambition and survival, now moved on separate courses. What thoughts occupied the emperor in those solitary hours? Did he recall the nights when his mother's counsel guided every decision, when her presence steadied his uncertain steps toward power? And in her seaside villa, did Agrippina imagine a future in which the bond between them might still be restored? Or did she already sense that the distance had become a gulf too wide to cross? History records no answer, only the silence of a relationship approaching its final breach. The first winter rains arrived over Rome with a slow, steady persistence. Clouds gathered from the west, and the Tiber swelled to the edges of its stone embankments. The sound of water dripping from tiled roofs mixed with the clatter of wagons hauling firewood through the narrow streets. The city, accustomed to seasonal change, settled into a quieter rhythm. Within this ordinary Roman winter, the imperial household maintained a surface of tranquil routine. Yet beneath the formal gestures and prescribed ceremonies, a deeper stillness began to feel less like peace and more like an uneasy pause. Nero held court as expected. He attended Senate meetings when protocol demanded, listened to reports from provincial governors, and approved the routine disbursement of funds for public works. His signature flowed across wax tablets with practiced ease. In the evenings, he invited poets and musicians to perform in small gatherings. The emperor himself occasionally sang or played the cithara, drawing soft applause from companions who knew their expressions of admiration were part of their duty. The lamps of the palace glowed warm against the damp night, a beacon on the Palatine Hill. For those close to him, the emperor's demeanor seemed outwardly serene. Yet the absence of his mother at these gatherings was unmistakable. Her chair, once placed at a respectful distance but still within sight, now stood unused in a storeroom. No servant mentioned it. At her villa by the sea, Agrippina received the season with deliberate calm. The waves rolled in steady intervals, their winter foam bright against the dark sand. Servants trimmed the olive trees and stacked wood for the chill nights. She managed her estates with the same discipline that had long sustained her. Letters arrived from friends and distant allies, bringing news of trade, harvest yields, and the political murmurs of Rome. She read them by lamplight, her expression composed, betraying neither satisfaction nor alarm. Visitors found her gracious but reserved. Conversations touched on practical matters: the maintenance of roads after heavy rains, the price of Egyptian grain, the health of distant cousins. Rarely did she speak of the emperor, though the silence itself carried meaning. In the city, daily commerce slowed but never ceased. Fishmongers braved the wet cobblestones to sell catches from the coast. Vendors warmed their hands over braziers while hawking olives, chickpeas, and spiced wine. Citizens huddled under porticos to exchange news, and inevitably the talk returned to the imperial family. Some wondered whether the emperor and his mother would ever appear together in public again. Others shrugged, accepting the separation as a natural course of rule. A young man grown to full authority, a mother whose purpose had been fulfilled. Yet even those indifferent to politics sensed a tension that hung like mist over the city. Seneca and Burrus continued their careful stewardship. They ensured the stability of the treasury, the discipline of the guard, and the steady flow of grain to the capital. But they also understood that their influence, while still valued, rested on the shifting foundation of imperial favor. They spoke little of Agrippina in council meetings, but each recognized that her distance carried implications. A mother who had once secured the empire for her son remained, by lineage and reputation, a figure of significance. Should suspicion arise, whether justified or imagined, it could alter the balance of power overnight. The midwinter festivals came and went. The Saturnalia, with its temporary reversals of social order, filled the streets with music and laughter. Homes glowed with oil lamps and wreaths of evergreen. Slaves dined beside masters, and gifts of small coins or sweets passed from hand to hand. Nero presided over official ceremonies with appropriate cheer. He offered generous donations for public games and allowed the people a longer holiday. But Agrippina did not appear at his side. Her absence, unremarked in formal announcements, was nonetheless conspicuous. Senators noted the omission. Merchants and citizens repeated it in quiet conversations. Rome understood symbols, and a mother absent from the imperial celebrations was a symbol none could ignore. Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, quietly increased patrols near the imperial residence. He offered no explanation, merely citing the need for vigilance during the crowded festivals. Yet his men understood the subtle message. The emperor's safety required watchfulness. Rumors hinted that certain courtiers, eager for favor, warned Nero of imagined conspiracies. Names were whispered, motives invented. Most were trivial inventions, but they served to reinforce the idea that danger might arise from unexpected quarters. In this atmosphere, even the quiet dignity of Agrippina's retreat could be interpreted as strategy. Distance might suggest disloyalty. Silence could be read as plotting. Servants carried messages between the Palatine and the coastal villa, their journeys marked by the cold drizzle of winter. Letters were brief, courteous, and free of personal warmth. They conveyed necessary information, acknowledgement of gifts, inquiries about health, but nothing more. Among the palace staff, speculation grew. Some believed reconciliation was still possible, that the emperor would one day summon his mother back to a place of honor. Others sensed that the distance had hardened into permanence. No one dared to speak these thoughts aloud in the emperor's presence. As the year turned, Rome awaited the first hints of spring. The rains began to ease, and the Tiber gradually lowered within its banks. Citizens prepared for the coming planting season, inspecting tools and repairing carts. In the villa at Antium, Agrippina walked the shoreline at dusk, her cloak drawn against the chill. The horizon stretched endless and gray, the sea's rhythm steady as breath. She had lived through storms of far greater fury, yet the calm she now faced felt heavier than any tempest. Did she sense the change gathering beyond the quiet horizon? Did she weigh the choices of a lifetime? Alliances forged, risks taken, power won and relinquished, and wonder how much of the future remained in her grasp? History offers no words from her lips, only the soft murmur of the sea and the silence of a mother waiting for what she could not name. Spring returned to the Italian coast with slow persistence. The air warmed, carrying the scent of new grass and the faint sweetness of blossoming almond trees. In Rome, markets brightened with early vegetables and the clatter of wagons bringing grain from Ostia. Life in the capital resumed its familiar rhythm of trade, worship, and talk. Yet the quiet distance between the emperor and his mother remained unbroken. Nero moved further into the life he had chosen. He staged private musical contests and planned a grand tour of Greece, where he hoped to perform before audiences steeped in centuries of art. He listened politely to the advice of Seneca and Burrus, but increasingly followed his own preferences. The Senate, seeing his confidence, offered routine support and avoided confrontation. In public, the young ruler appeared serene. He attended games, approved minor reforms to provincial taxes, and continued funding aqueduct repairs. Citizens, for the moment, found little to criticize. Grain was plentiful, festivals abundant, and the treasury sound. But in private, those closest to the emperor observed a subtle wariness. He spoke little of his mother, yet her name seemed to hover at the edge of conversations. When a courier mentioned her villa at Antium, a brief shadow crossed Nero's face before he turned the discussion to music or architecture. At her seaside estate, Agrippina maintained her careful routines. Servants prepared the gardens for summer bloom, and visitors from old senatorial families came to pay formal respects. She received them with quiet dignity, offering measured conversation about trade routes, harvest prospects, and the ever-shifting politics of the provinces. Those who dined with her noticed the steadiness of her manner. She neither complained of her son's distance nor sought sympathy. She seemed to inhabit a space beyond disappointment, guided by the discipline that had carried her through decades of peril. Letters continued to pass between mother and son, each one brief and impeccably courteous. They contained the necessary acknowledgments of gifts and formal wishes for health, but nothing of affection or shared memory. It was an exchange of words that maintained form while yielding no warmth. Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, felt the tension without seeing its end. His men patrolled with quiet precision, keeping the peace in a city always alert for unrest. He offered Nero steady counsel. To avoid unnecessary provocation, to preserve stability, to maintain appearances of harmony. The emperor listened, nodded, and said little. Seneca, older now and increasingly weary of court life, devoted more time to philosophical writing. He too urged caution, aware that suspicion could be as dangerous as open conflict. But both advisors understood that their influence depended on the emperor's willingness to hear them, a willingness that seemed to wane with each passing month. Rome itself remained calm. Citizens enjoyed the spring festivals and the promise of a good harvest. Artisans mended roof tiles damaged by winter storms. Children played along the riverbanks as the Tiber's waters receded. To the ordinary eye, the empire stood secure. Yet, in the quiet conversations of senators and merchants, the separation between Nero and Agrippina remained a topic of careful speculation. Some wondered whether the emperor might reconcile with his mother, if only for the stability her presence once guaranteed. Others believed the divide too deep to bridge. Everyone understood that in the intricate politics of the Julio-Claudian house, family distance could be more dangerous than open hostility. Early that summer, a report reached the palace that Agrippina planned to visit Rome to offer formal prayers at a public festival. Courtiers waited to see how the emperor would respond. No invitation was sent, no carriage dispatched. Instead, a polite message traveled back along the coastal road, acknowledging her intentions and wishing her good health, but making no promise of welcome. Agrippina, ever careful, delayed her journey. She cited the demands of estate management and the unpredictable weather along the coastal route. To outward eyes, it was a simple change of plan. But those who knew the language of Roman politics understood. A mother had sought the presence of her son, and the son had declined. The months that followed passed with deceptive tranquility. Rome's streets bustled with trade. Public entertainments filled the amphitheaters with music and the shouts of spectators. Ships arrived from Alexandria heavy with grain and spices. Agrippina remained at her villa, overseeing the harvest of olives and the repair of seawalls. Nero continued to refine his plans for a journey to Greece and expanded work on the gardens and water features that would one day form the core of his golden house. No public quarrel erupted. No decree announced a change in the mother's status. Instead, an unspoken understanding settled across the empire. The young emperor ruled alone, and the woman who had once guided his every step now lived apart, honored in title but excluded from power. Later chroniclers, writing with the advantage of hindsight, would debate the feelings behind these actions. Some imagined Nero driven by fear, believing that his mother's lineage and influence threatened his independence. Others saw in Agrippina a silent strategist, maintaining a posture of dignity that might preserve her life. The surviving records offer no intimate confession. We have only the observations of senators, servants, and distant officials. The polite letters, the careful ceremonies, the gradual withdrawal that required no formal decree. As summer deepened, the Mediterranean shimmered beneath a relentless sun. Waves rolled toward the shore in steady cadence. Agrippina walked the terrace of her villa at dusk, the salt wind lifting the edge of her cloak. The empire she had helped shape stretched beyond the horizon. Provinces and legions, roads and markets, the lives of millions, all continuing regardless of her presence. In Rome, Nero presided over another festival, the applause of the crowd mingling with music and the distant tolling of temple bells. He spoke to the people of prosperity and art, of future journeys and the glories of Greece. Not once did he mention the woman who had once secured his crown. The silence between them had become its own conclusion. A mother and son bound by blood, separated by choice, their fates now moving on diverging paths. History would not leave the story untouched. In the years ahead, new conflicts, rebellions, and the great fire of Rome would shape Nero's reign. Agrippina's name would return to the pages of chroniclers, woven into later dramas of accusation and tragedy. Yet the quiet season of distance, the long months when nothing overtly happened, remains as significant as any dramatic act. It reveals the slow power of estrangement, the way empires shift not only through battles and decrees but through silences that no decree can mend. For the people of Rome, life continued. Merchants haggling at dawn, children racing through sunlit alleys, farmers guiding carts across the stone roads built by generations before them. The empire endured, vast and indifferent, as mother and son lived out the remainder of their separate courses. The sea kept its rhythm. The Tiber flowed toward the distant coast. And the story of Agrippina, daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula, mother of an emperor, settled into history, where endings are seldom sudden and finality often arrives not with an act, but with a quiet, irreversible drift. This concludes the complete, calm historical account of Agrippina, the mother who murdered emperors to put her son on the throne, told in the boring history for sleep style across all chapters, reaching the natural close of her relationship with Nero and the quiet turning of Rome's imperial age.